Good morning, everybody. It's for the record, 9:05 a.m. on November 18th, 2020. Appreciate y'all joining us this morning, the GMA 14 members and the interlocal participants, as we move forward with our efforts to set desired future conditions for the GMA. Please note that, especially the panelists, you guys have the ability to have open mics, so try and keep the background noise down, especially anything that might give us feedback. Otherwise, today's meeting has the potential to rival our April meeting in length. With any luck, it won't. I think that went 3¼ hours. But it's an important meeting. Its main focus is, or its only real focus is private property rights. And because of its importance, we have quite a few experts that will be presenting this morning. So without further ado, why don't we officially call this meeting to order and move along to agenda item 2, which is confirmation of receipt of posted notices. And each of the GMA members have provided me copies of their posted notices. I can confirm that mine have been properly posted. So we are good to go with that agenda item. Agenda item 3, welcome and introductions. I'll fire it up. And my name is John Martin. I'm the General Manager of the Southeast Texas Groundwater Conservation District and Chairman of GMA 14. I'll hand it off to Zach.
Zach Holland with Bluebonnet GCD.
Next, how about Gary?
Good morning, everyone. This is Gary, Lower Trinity Groundwater District. I take care of supporting Polk County and San Jacinto County. Howdy to everyone.
Morning. Sam.
Hi, Samantha Ryder, representing Lone Star GCD. We handle Montgomery County.
Michael, introduce yourself. I don't think we've met yet.
Yes, my name is Michael White. I'm representing Brazoria County Groundwater.
Great. Nice to meet you, Mike.
Nice to meet you, John.
That's the GMA members. How about our interlocal participants? Pudge, how are you this morning? Looks like Pudge is muted. Can we get him unmuted? No? Shows that he's unmuted. I think maybe we're having a bandwidth problem, Pudge. Moving along, we do have Kirk with us this morning. How are you, Kirk? Kirk is self-muted. You out there, Kirk?
I'm sorry. Yes. Sorry about that. I just don't
There
have
you
a
go.
camera, guys. So good to see all of you.
You too, sir. And how about our subsidence district? Mr. Turco.
Morning, my name is Mike Turco. I'm General Manager of the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District.
Robert, you on
Yeah,
with
my
us?
name-
There you are.
Robert Thompson with the Fort Bend Subsidence District.
Mr. French, how are you this morning?
Doing good, thank you. Larry French with the Texas Water Development Board. I'm Director of the Groundwater Division there.
And last but not least, Mr. Oliver.
Morning, everybody. Wade Oliver with Intero.
Did I get everybody? Did we get everybody? Okay, looks like we got the introductions in order. I do believe we got maybe 6, 8. I don't think we have quite 10, but we've got quite a few people who have submitted comment request forms. Let me get to them. I'm going to go through them as I receive them and put them up into our site, onto our Dropbox file. Looks like I have Miss Norton first. Miss Laura Norton, are you available? Are you out there? Chat, I do not.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. There you go.
Okay, it said I was unmuted, but then a woman came on, not any of you, and said you have been unmuted. Anyway, thank you for this opportunity to speak. Many of you know me as a MUD 47 director, but last night I was appointed to my board to serve on the Woodlands Water Board of Trustees, in part probably because I mentioned in my stump speech that I've been coming to these meetings advocating for Woodlands residents' property rights and their right to live in a community that promotes sustainable groundwater pumping. I hear there's lots of lawyers on this call today, so I say there's evidence beyond the shadow of a doubt that pumping more than 70,000 acre-feet per year results in water table drops and increased subsidence. I say this because of the empirical evidence from PAM 13 site that shows a subsidence slowdown when the SJRA surface water treatment plant came online in 2015. Today, I can't believe we're even contemplating 3 pumping scenarios that would take us back to those days of irreversible and irresponsible pumping. And on the subject of property rights and property values harmed by aggressive groundwater pumping, the Woodlands has over 40,000 homes. 5,000 homes are between the Jones Fault and Panther Branch Fault, homes that are in the Graben. 6 of those homes in the Graben are repetitive loss properties as defined by FEMA. Every multi-decade resident of Alden Bridge knows that flooding on Research Forest Drive is getting worse over time. And does anyone think it's smart to throw even a little more subsidence into our future? I got elected to the trustee board last night because I fought for my residents' property rights, and I continue to do so here this morning. It's ridiculous to think that our representatives are promoting annual groundwater withdrawal levels that in all 3 models lead to irreversible subsidence. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you, Ms. Norton. Next up, Mr. Chapman. You out there, Mr. Chapman? Floor is yours.
Mr. Martin, could you give us a first name?
Edward.
Hey, Mr. Martin, Edward is not on the line.
Okay. For the record, Mr. Chapman has submitted written comments. Please be sure, if you haven't already read them, to do so. Next, we have Mr. Lux, Bob Lux.
There we go. I am unmuted. Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Martin and members of the GMA 14 Joint Planning Committee. My name is Bob Lux. I reside in the Woodlands, Texas. I am currently the president of Montgomery County MEB 60, and just as Ms. Norton, yesterday I was elected to the Board of Trustees for the Woodlands Water Agency. I also serve on the Texas Water Conservation Association as a member of the Board of Directors, as well as on the Groundwater Committee. And I served as the Gulf Coast Region Trustee for the Association of Water Board Directors. Thank you, Chairman Barton and the GMA 14 Joint Planning Committee members for allowing me to speak this morning. Over the past several months, you have been presented with volumes of scientific, financial, and legal information associated with accelerated groundwater withdrawals from aquifers beneath GMA 14. My concern centers around the enormous long-term negative impacts these actions will suffer upon future generations throughout GMA 14. In 1952, John Steinbeck wrote East of Eden, While the book isn't about water, themes of water flow through it as a metaphor for the cycles of life, drought and flood, alternately parch and quench. In the book, Steinbeck wrote the following prose, which is as true today as a century ago, and I quote, "It never failed that during the dry years, the people forgot about the rich years, and during the wet years, they lost all memory of the dry years. It was always that way." Despite incurring floods of record proportions, Texas has recently suffered through years of drought. Records show this is not the first such drought, and forecasts indicate this certainly will not be the last. What will happen should we continue to draw down our aquifer levels to dangerous levels that simultaneously experiencing a record drought? If we are to have any hope of changing this cycle of crisis and forgetfulness, we must have to start thinking differently. The influential actions of a small set of powerful yet narrowly self-interested parties acting to protect and even expand their own uses of water at the expense of all other uses, human and environmental, for generations must not prevail. It is certainly in the best interest of some to continue this self-serving charade that groundwater is something private and not a public resource. GMA 14 is interconnected. Our populations are large, growing, and intertwined. Our fresh, easily, and cost-effectively accessible groundwater resources are finite and dwindling. Narrow self-interests and the resultant damage to many must not be tolerated. The unfair enrichment of a few will result in the impoverishment of everyone else for generations to come. As we deliberate over the next several months, please choose to serve the common good of the public rather than serve the vocal and politically powerful private special interests. Thank you for your time and consideration. I end my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Lux. Next up, Miss Glenna Sloan. Good morning, Miss Sloan.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can. How are you this morning?
I'm very well, and I thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Glenna Sloan. I am an ordinary citizen interested in groundwater. I've been attending the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District Board meeting since the workshop on January 15th, 2019, as well as GMA 14 meetings. To say that the learning curve on the subject of groundwater is steep is to state the obvious. For a layman, it's like gulping from a fire hose. I live in Shenandoah, and the most important skin in this groundwater game is that of my children and my grandchildren. I believe in science. I believe there is such a thing as subsidence. And there are areas in Montgomery County where the ground is sinking and will continue to do so if too much groundwater continues to be pumped out of the ground. If it were a matter of living in a desert with no other source of water, maybe I would reconsider my stance, but we don't. We have other available surface water resources. Groundwater is very slowly replenished. If too much is drawn out of the aquifer, all of us in the county will eventually suffer the consequences. It might be higher taxes to pay for fire stations whose foundations are cracking. It might be our elderly neighbor's house whose walls and foundations are cracking without the financial means to repair the damage. Or it might be our children's brand new home purchased in an area of 2 to 3 feet of subsidence. This resource must be managed carefully to mitigate harm to the properties of ourselves, our families, our neighbors, whether those neighbors be next door counties or literally next door. My expectation is that all conservation districts will live up to their names and be as frugal as possible in the expenditure of groundwater, our children's water, and our neighbors' water. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Sloan. Next up, Mr. Kelling, how are you this morning?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can. How you doing, Ron?
Great. Good morning to the members of the GMA 14 and guests. My name's Ron Kelling. I'm the Deputy General Manager of the San Jacinto River Authority. Our authority is the owner of permanent groundwater wells in Montgomery County and owner of property in Montgomery and Harris counties within GMA 14. First of all, I want to say that it's regrettable that some have brought a street fight regarding groundwater from Montgomery County into this process. It's unfortunate that some choose to be unprofessional in their approach up to and including posing threats to this committee should they choose not to support their viewpoint. As public servants, you are simply trying to fulfill your responsibilities in protecting the water resources in this region for current and future residents. You do not deserve the brash attitude that is delivered to you by some, and I assure you this approach is not representative of the majority of residents in Montgomery County. Moving on, during your previous meetings, we have all already heard a lot about private property rights, particularly regarding the property owner who wants to drill a well on their property and extract groundwater. You've also heard the opinion that the rights are the only criteria included in section 36.104 of the Texas Code that are protected under the US Constitution, and therefore the other 8 criteria referenced in that section should be disregarded. But to disregard the other criteria in chapter 36 would be to disregard another constitutional provision, and that is section 59, article 16 of the Texas Constitution. Chapter 36 clearly states, in order to provide for the conservation, preservation, protection, recharge, and prevention of waste of groundwater and of groundwater reservoirs and their subdivisions, and to control subsidence caused by withdrawal of water, consistent with objectives of section 59, article 16, Texas Constitution, groundwater districts could be created. These districts are the state's preferred method of groundwater management in order to protect property rights, balance the conservation and development of groundwater to meet the needs of the state, and use the best available science in the conservation and development of groundwater through rules developed, adopted, and promulgated by district. It is this balancing of these various considerations that leads to the protection of all property rights and the fulfillment of these constitutional objectives. This balancing theme is also mentioned in chapter 36, which specifically requires the desired future conditions must provide a balance between the highest practical level of groundwater production and the conservation, preservation, protection, recharge, and prevention of waste of groundwater and control of subsidence in the management area. In regards to property rights, why shouldn't the property right of the landowner who is negatively impacted by subsidence resulting of pumpage of groundwater by other landowners be equally protected? Why shouldn't the private property rights of the landowner whose own groundwater production is sacrificed by the pumpage of other landowners be equally protected? Chapter 36 requires a DFC explanatory report that documents all criteria considered by GMA and requires the Water Development Board to determine that this report is administratively complete prior to the adoption of all applicable DFCs. A representative of the Water Development Board participates in each meeting of the GMA 14 Joint Planning Committee. So shouldn't the Water Development Board provide guidance to this committee regarding this issue? Perhaps specific questions could be posed to the Water Development Board as follows. Does the Water Development Board agree that private property rights should be the sole criteria considered in establishing the desired future conditions, and therefore the 8 remaining other criteria, including impacts from subsidence, be disregarded? Would Ward Development Board approve a DFC report if it failed to document consideration of all criteria other than just private property rights? And we appreciate the opportunity to provide these comments to you this morning. And once again, we appreciate your public service to meeting the needs of the water of all current and future residents of the area. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron. Next, I have John Yours, and I think it was Mr. Yours. Did he send me an email that said he would not be able to make it online this morning? But yes, Mr. Yours, any chance you did make it on? Otherwise, item 4F is Mr. Yours. He did provide written comments to the board. If you haven't read them, please do so. And
Mr. Martin,
yes,
John Yours is on the line and I have unmuted him.
great. Mr. Yours, how are you this morning?
Hey, I'm fine. I don't need to reread those comments as long as the board members have them. Thank you.
Thank you much, sir. Moving along. Mr. Lilac, Robert Lilac, please.
You hear me now?
We can, sir. How are you this morning?
Very good. Thank you. And I appreciate the opportunity to address the board this morning. My name is Robert Lilac. I have had the privilege of addressing this board on at least 2 prior occasions, most recently by letter last September 15th. As previously noted, I serve on the Woodlands Drainage Task Force, now the One Water Task Force, and as president of the Woodlands Mud Number 1. I live in an area known as Grogan's Point in South Montgomery County, an area severely impacted by 3 major flooding events in the past 5 years. This area has experienced 4 to 10 plus inches of subsidence in the last 20 to 25 years alone. About 100 homes have flooded in Grogan's Point, many of them with less than 1 foot of water. I have repeatedly gone on record as opposing increases in groundwater pumping and changing the DFC for the Lone Star Groundwater District. There is undisputed evidence presented to this board that excessive groundwater pumping directly causes irreversible subsidence in many parts of Montgomery and Harris counties. Further, it results in declines in aquifers that will render wells non-productive or require significant investments to replace or modify them to remain productive. There is also evidence that groundwater depletion causes changes along fault lines throughout the 2 counties. It is unacceptable to allow increased pumpage, which will create even greater risks of flooding, while at the same time, my mud and at least 4 other muds in Montgomery County have spent or are committed to spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to mitigate flooding by Spring Creek. These efforts will be offset or neutralized by continuing subsidence if pumpage limits are increased. SJRA's Porta Measure or PAM 13 data shows conclusively that limiting pumping in Montgomery County to about 64,000 or so feet stops further declines in aquifer levels. It is clear to me that we have proven measures of sustainable water drawdowns and that we have reached its sustainable limits, in spite of all the computer modeling that is subject to bias and error. I am far more comfortable with PAM 13 facts than all the reams of computer modeling output that has been formed. LSGCD's Plan DFC will cause subsidence to continue in South Montgomery County, increase future and costly flood damage, lower home values, reduce tax assessments, and further increase the costs of flood mitigation. This is totally unacceptable, and Lone Star's proposed DFC should be denied. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, our last submitted form. Miss Penny Bradshaw, are you with us this morning?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can. How are you this morning?
I'm good. Okay. I'm a bit more esoteric on my approach here. I am just a resident of Montgomery County. I don't have all the credentials behind me, but I'm become very interested in following water issues within this county. So I just have some comments really relating to our Texas Water Code, my thoughts on that. So let me begin. Under section 35.001 of the Water Code, in order to provide for the conservation, preservation, protection, recharging, and prevention of waste of groundwater and of groundwater reservoirs, water subdivisions, and to control subsidence caused by withdrawal of water from those underground reservoirs or their subdivisions, groundwater management areas may be created. Under 36.0015B, groundwater conservation districts are the state's preferred method of groundwater management in order to protect property rights, balance the conservation and development of groundwater, and use the best available science. In 36.002A, the legislature recognizes that a landowner owns the groundwater below the surface of the land as real property. And under 36.002B entitles that landowner to drill for and produce the groundwater below the surface of real property without causing waste or malicious drainage of other property or negligently causing subsidence. And still this battle continues between property rights and preservation of our finite water resources and who is or isn't allowed to pump water from the aquifers. There are many rules in place for planning and modeling an organization to answer to other organizations who answer to other organizations within the water industry. And yet judges continue to rule on the side of property rights. But at what point do the rights of others hold sway? In a few sections I referenced above, subsidence is mentioned multiple times and is mentioned within the context of groundwater management areas and groundwater conservation districts being created and given authority to not only preserve and protect our groundwater, but also to control subsidence due to overpumping and negligence. I mention this because subsidence appears to be one issue that should offer support to other individuals' rights. But how do we build this case with the entrenched Texas culture of private property rights? We have a water code that creates management and conservation entities, but doesn't allow for tools with which to hold accountable those who do not follow the rules. How can we find a way to effect changes to the Texas Water Code that takes into consideration everyone else's rights? Laws regulating groundwater and surface water in Texas might have held up when first written, but over time, population growth and industry demand have placed a heavier burden on the need to better manage and preserve our limited resources. And without a well-thought-out policy, water policy, growth in this state may ultimately become limited due to the scarcity of water. Thank you for allowing me to present my comments.
Thank you, Ms. Bradshaw. Okay, I believe Sam, did James want to speak here? I did not get the form yet, but I've been so busy the last few minutes. If he did email and I did not get it. Can you hear me?
I think he was dialing in.
Okay.
Mr. Martin, was that name Mr. James Beach?
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Beach, you are unmuted if you'd like to speak.
Are you with us, James? Oh, maybe now. Anybody else have the Jeopardy theme going through their head? Okay, why don't we open the floor up to anybody else, and maybe James can get on and let us know when he has done so. I think he can send can he send a chat to letting us know he's made it on or something?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. So that being said, are there any other folks out there in general public who would like to make a public comment? If so, let us know. Give us your name and we'll go from there. Do they have to raise their hand first? Is there a process for them to do that? Audio attendees chat. Does not appear that we have any other members of public out there wanting to speak at this time. Have we been able to
Mr.
get
Martin?
James? Yes.
Oh, yes. Simon Sequeira has raised his hand.
Okay. Good morning, Simon. How are you today?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can. How are you, sir?
All right, appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Martin. Thank you, committee members. Also, want to thank the public and all the comments made this morning. It's certainly not lost on me that there are a lot of different opinions out there related to groundwater. I'm here today for a few reasons. First, I'm here to defend those that can't defend themselves against the government. The end users of water in Montgomery County are really the victims of this water scandal. And if I and others don't stand up for them, then no one will. But I'm also here to defend my rights. I think it's a sad state of affairs that as a private business person, I'm forced to defend my rights on such a regular basis. But I believe if you don't know your rights, then you don't have rights. And if you're not prepared to defend your rights, then you don't have rights. What has taken place in Montgomery County over the last 2 decades should never be allowed to happen anywhere else ever again. SJRA and the old Lone Star Board has socialized our water. A few elitists got together and they came up with a plan that required no oversight and no approval. And they alone decided to replace our private property rights in groundwater with a permitting scheme. Now, I think we all know how the story goes, but the effect is the poorest communities are subsidizing the wealthiest community's water bill. That's how socialism works. And true to form, just like any other socialistic plan, a select few at the top come out ahead. That's why Senator Robert Nichols was against this plan and called it a behind closed door deal. SJRA sitting at the helm of the Lone Star groundwater ship easily accomplished this. And at least some of these people knew what they were doing was wrong. Private property rights are a pillar of our democracy. It dates back to before the Magna Carta. The founders of our Constitution recognize that free people and free markets cannot survive without private property rights. What the SJRA did is wrong, it is unethical, it is immoral, and I'm out to prove it was illegal. This is a flawed system. You know this better than anybody. The system of groundwater regulation pits communities and counties against each other. In a water-rich part of the state, it makes no sense. Now, I am more than willing to continue the path of regulation by litigation if I have to. And yes, I'm trying to break the system. And I think we've been very successful to date, and I think the best may be yet to come. But I'm not doing this because I don't believe in groundwater regulation or so someone can have all the water they want. I'm spending my personal time and treasure trying to unravel this mess because it doesn't work for everyone, because it's discriminatory. The system does not allow for fair share. And worst of all, this pits neighbors against each other, and we're forced to fight each other over how much water each other gets. The citizens of Montgomery County and across the GMA need you to look at this from their perspective. We all need you to take a step back, view this issue through the lens of the Fifth Amendment. That's where you will find the answer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Beach, any
Mr.
chance
Martin?
you... Yes.
Yes, we have unmuted Mr. Beach.
Yay. Good morning, James. How are you today?
I think there may be an issue. I think he might be listed twice potentially. He's got an audio and a video, and so I'm wondering if the unmuting is happening on the video and he's calling in.
If he has called in, we have no other capabilities. I only see him listed once on the attendee, and he is unmuted. So perhaps he could call back in and re-enter an audio pin if he'd like to speak.
Hopefully he's hearing that.
We'll give James a minute or so to see if he can accomplish that. Any signs of James yet?
James is on the line. We're having a little difficulty on the audio pin because it is a call. So,
Can you hear us, James? More importantly, can we hear you?
So he is messaging that he can hear us, but unfortunately, without an audio pin, we are unable to unmute him in our system.
I apologize for that technical difficulty. I believe Sam had mentioned that James has a few bullet points. Maybe he can send those along and I can get them forwarded to the GMA group and the interlocal participants. At least we'll have them on record to review. And barring that, has anybody else raised their hand?
I do not see any other attendees who have their hand raised.
Thank you very much. Then we should just move along to the next agenda item. Thank you, everybody, for your public comments. Agenda item 5 is discussion and possible action.
John?
Yes.
John, can I interrupt you for a second?
Absolutely.
James is calling me. Can I just put him on speaker? We'll do this. This isn't the old fashioned. This is
I'm
something else.
game. I'm game.
Hey,
James.
Can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Wade. And my comments may not be worth all the weight, but I'm going to go because we've taken a lot of time already here. Apologize for the difficulty. I'm James Beach. I'm a consulting hydrogeologist for the Lone Star Groundwater Conservation District. As we all know, Lone Star is a Chapter 36 district. In developing DSCs, the district is required to balance maximum practicable production with conservation. In determining that grand balance, the district is required, to consider those 9 factors, and we're considering one of those today. And the group has done a great job of going through all the rest of them in other meetings. Private property is a strong consideration in Lone Star GCD, as it is in many other areas of the state. It is important because access to groundwater is a critical part of the economic development and sustainability in many areas of Texas. Access and use of private property, including groundwater, has important ramifications on many socioeconomic issues. Finding the grand balance called for in Chapter 36 is a local and a regional decision to be developed in concert with other districts in the GMA. I'm not sure if the graphic that I sent to John and Harris Galveston can be put up, but what it shows is that the counties in GMA 14, historically, if we look at 2009 pumping, and that's data that Wade Oliver had presented back in 2019. The variation in acre feet per square mile is from 3 to 172 acre feet per square mile in different counties. And the idea is, part of the reason that there's such a variation, of course, is historical development, and and there's a dovetailing with private property use across the whole GMA in that regard. Progressive development of groundwater management concepts at Lone Star over the years has been shaped by local and regional affected parties, new court decisions, legislative changes in demographics, demands, and overall water strategies. As we look across the state, GMA 14 and Lone Star are not alone in this debate and are having to adjust within this DFC process. Lone Star continues to work with other districts in GMA 14 to find a balance of competing objectives locally and regionally. We appreciate the opportunity to bring those back to the table, and thank you all for allowing me to work through the technical difficulties. I appreciate it.
Thanks, James. Okay, moving along to agenda item 5, discussion and possible action to approve minutes of the September 16, 2020 GMA 14 joint planning meetings. You guys haven't had those quite as long as I would have liked, but you have had them for a few days. I wonder if anybody noticed that the attachments to those meetings was just short of 100 pages. So definitely a lot to put together for those minutes, and we owe Zach a big thanks for putting all that together, or at least the minutes part of it. Thank you, sir. And with that, I will entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
John, this is Gary. I make a proposal we approve the minutes.
Thank you, sir. How about a second?
It's Sam. I second.
Okay, any discussion on them? Hearing nobody. All in favor of, say aye. Maybe I should do a nay. Got thumbs up, probably be easier to do. Agree. Anybody opposed? Hearing none. We have approved our minutes unanimously. And we move along to agenda item number 6. Update from the Texas Water Development Board and discussion of any related items of interest to GMA 14. Mr. French, have anything for us today?
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I've got a couple of things, pretty briefly though. First of all, let me thank those who've made public comment, and I can assure you we're listening very closely, and our board follows, groundwater issues throughout the state, but is particularly very much aware and interested in the private property issues that have been discussed thus far. So thank you very much for all those who've commented. Just a couple of things. I want to remind the members and audience that we do have updated guidance documents on the joint planning process and DFC issues, as well as the explanatory report available on our website. I think I've mentioned that previously, but given some of the comments, I did want to kind of reemphasize that. You can find that on our agency website or reach out to me if you need further help in finding those. But those will be helpful to you all as you're preparing your explanatory report and completing the process. A couple other things. Just want to mention also that earlier this week, the Water Development Board representatives listened in to a presentation by the U.S. Geological Survey on the progress of the Gulf 2023 model, which is under development. That's going to be a regional model that will, the idea is ultimately that will be used as the planning tool in future joint planning cycles. The USGS is making great progress there. It's a challenging project, but they're making good progress, and we believe there'll be a good improvement on the technical tools that'll be available to all of you in the future. So that's I just want to let you know that we have been engaged and following the progress of that work. And then finally, it's not a groundwater issue, but I'm sure many of you are aware of the recent formation of regional flood planning groups across the state. And within the GMA 14 footprint, I believe there are 5 or 6 individual flood planning groups that have been formed. These are getting off the ground and will do very important work. Given the comments I'm hearing about concern of subsidence and flooding and so forth, I know that even though it's not a groundwater direct issue, the hydrologic cycle is very connected, and I just wanted to let members and audience know that if you're interested in the flood planning process, certainly there's a lot of information on our agency website to cover those processes. So with that, those are the comments that I have, and be happy to entertain any questions and give it back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Anybody have any questions for Larry? Okay, moving along then. We shall now convene as a meeting of the GMA 14 Joint Planning Interlocal Agreement participants. This is where I reckon we're probably going to get a little bit lengthy. My thought right now is to take a short break after item number 7, and then fire back up and hopefully knock the remainder of the meeting out after that. Item 7 is presentation and discussion regarding takings claims to better understand the impact on the interests and rights in private property, including ownership and the rights of management area landowners and their lessees and assigns in groundwater as recognized under section 3602 as required by chapter 36, 108D7. I've invited a bunch of experts today, and our first one is Ms. Deborah Trejo. How are you this morning, Ms. Trejo?
Hi there. Thanks for inviting me to speak with you all today. I am really here to just sort of provide black letter law and experience on the ground in dealing with takings law. My thought is to sort of give an overview of some of the legal principles, but then really be available to you all to ask questions that have arisen. I haven't been part of your meetings. I heard the comments today, which were varied, but I don't have a dog in the fight, so I'm not here on behalf of any of the interested parties in GMA 14, but I do have a lot of experience with constitutional law, and including in particular takings law. I do work for the Edwards Aquifer Authority. We serve as their general counsel and represent some other groundwater conservation districts as well, in addition to counties and other sorts of districts and cities and private entities. So if that is agreeable to the chair, then I'll just sort of get into the topic, but I just want to encourage you all to stop me, or even if you want to right now say anything that would be particularly helpful to help clarify for you all.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it sounds like you got a good plan in your head, and that's exactly why we have invited you, is to get, the letter of the law kind of issue with regards to takings claims. So we appreciate you being here.
And okay, thank you. And I think what I guess I want to say from the beginning is that I think a lot of times things are placed in very black and white kinds of narratives. But I think when you're looking at takings law from the governmental side, you can't really think of it unless you understand it from the litigant property owner side, right? I mean, in other words, in order to understand what your risks are, you need to understand what are viable claims that could be made against you as a government when you're trying to take some action, right? So, okay, so first, just very, very big picture. The US Constitution, Fifth Amendment, has a takings clause that applies to federal action. Usually people talk about the Fifth Amendment, but really what they mean is the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment makes the Fifth Amendment applicable to the states. So, and then that's interpreted to include political subdivisions of the states. So when we talk about, for instance, groundwater districts or cities or counties, that there's a 14th Amendment right to not have your property taken by government without the payment of just compensation. The Texas Constitution, Article 1, Section 17, has a separate takings claim. And most takings claims that are litigated in Texas are actually under the Texas Constitution. There's some kind of complicated reasons for that in federal case law. But where a state provides a remedy and who you're challenging as a state actor, ordinarily you're going to be operating under the Texas Constitution. It doesn't really, there's some very new case law that we don't know how it's going to play out that provides more flexibility to private property owners to bring simultaneous claims under both the Texas Constitution and the federal Constitution. However, in general, the Texas courts follow federal law in takings claims. And so there really isn't a distinction, right? I mean, either your property was taken or it wasn't. you're not going to be found to have it taken in a federal court if it wasn't found to be taken in a Texas court. So I think it sort of doesn't matter what people throw around constitutional provisions and cite to different sections, but I think we can just say takings, right? And it really doesn't make that much of a difference. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Well, we have generally takings claims where what government does is effectively, practically very similar to eminent domain. That's where inverse condemnation or regulatory takings, physical takings, concepts derive from. So let's go back. Historically, armies would occupy people's properties and kick them out, and that's where this law developed. If government, and we see takings claims most sort of consistently with highways, right? So in order to construct highways or pipelines or transmission lines, government has to exercise its power of eminent domain. It's the same constitutional provision that your private property can't be taken without just compensation. So let's talk about so eminent domain is when government affirmatively takes your property for a highway or some other use, occupies it, kicks you out. And then they usually will begin proceedings to determine the value of that property. A regulatory taking is when a government action has the same practical effect of eminent domain. It either ousts you from property or so interferes with your ability to enjoy the use and enjoyment of your property that it's like they did kick you out. So sort of keep that in mind. So regular and in this inverse condemnation, so not eminent domain, but basically the practical equivalent of it, we have both regulatory takings and physical takings. So physical takings can occur when government action has the same effect on your property by physically occupying it as eminent domain would, right? So if not on purpose, and there have been some cases out of the Houston area in the Texas courts, government action leads to persistent flooding of your property so that it's no longer usable, that would be a physical taking because government action is resulting in physically flooding your property consistently. That could also occur. The most famous physical takings case that sort of set out the law involved governments allowing a transmission line for electricity, radio, that sort of line across your property. So pipelines, we see this all the time. So, but it involves the private landowner having to sue the government, where the government does not initiate an eminent domain claim. So, right now I'm involved in a lawsuit where the state is being sued for physically pumping oil and gas from a property that private landowners claim they own. So that would be a physical taking because the allegation says you physically pumped oil and gas from beneath my property, you the government. Not you allowed somebody else to do it, but you were involved in appropriating oil and gas from beneath my property. That's not normally the kind of physical taking or an eminent domain claim are not normally going to be brought against a groundwater regulation, right? What landowners are normally complaining about is whatever the groundwater district or maybe a county or a city did through regulation resulted in taking property. So what's the property? Well, we know from the Texas Supreme Court that in Texas, landowners own groundwater in place beneath their property. So that's one of the things that a property owner may own but ordinarily that's not a separated, severed right. Ordinarily, that it's an incident of ownership of the fee simple of your property, right? Is that you own the groundwater beneath your property. If it hasn't been severed, you also own the minerals underneath your property. And those would include oil and gas. Groundwater is not a mineral in Texas. You would also own the air above your property through common law ownership with the fee simple. So let's just think of a landowner who has a 5-acre ranchette, and what do they own? Well, they own the land, and they own what's beneath the land and sort of immediately above the land, right? The groundwater is one of the interests that they own in their property. And the courts have talked about the nature of property ownership as a bundle of sticks of rights in your property, right? Like you have the right to do certain things that are reasonable, that don't cause nuisance to your neighbors. Like you might play music, you might have a party and guest over, you might drive in and out of your property, and you might also drill a well and pump groundwater. And so it is important when we're talking about takings law to understand what does the property owner own, because the taking is going to be evaluated against the entirety of that ownership, not just one of those rights, okay? So if I am limited in my ability to use groundwater on my property, and the consequence of that is to mean I can't use my property. And there may be a lot of reasons. I may not have access to surface water. I may not, when I bought it, I had a well and I intended to use it. And now a groundwater district or maybe a city is telling me I can't, and my property has become unusable. That might be someone who could bring a takings claim, right? But let's say it makes my use of property, the regulation makes it more expensive. Well, now what we're going to look at is whether that's enough to constitute a taking, right? It isn't an absolute black and white that any restriction on use of your property equals a taking. If there's a physical invasion, it is absolute. So if government runs a teeny tiny wire across your property, like on the surface, if it was up high enough, like a power line, it's probably not going to be a problem. But let's say there's a little bitty wire that they insist on running all the way across your property. That's a physical taking. That's a physical occupation. They have to pay for it. In that very famous physical takings case in the U.S. Supreme Court, the damages, the amount of compensation the government had to pay was like $1. And if the physical invasion is so minimal, like this little bitty wire across your property that really isn't that big of a deal, they may not have to pay very much for that physical taking. But if there is a physical taking, either a little sliver to build a highway, which they use eminent domain, or they run a line or something else, repeated flooding, then it's absolute. It's just how much is the cost. If it's a regulatory taking, courts do a balancing test. So they look at, there's sort of 3 elements to establish in a takings claim. So once a landowner has an ownership interest that's been impacted by governmental regulation, and they feel their property has been taken, and they file a lawsuit under the Texas Constitution, maybe they raise also a 14th Amendment claim that their property has been taken, courts are going to look at 3 elements to determine whether or not there's sufficient interference with the use and enjoyment of property to constitute a taking. And those will be, what is the extent of economic impact of the governmental action? And what we'd look at is the before and after value of the property. So before the governmental regulation began to impact your property, how much was your property worth? And after the governmental impact, how much is your property worth? 1. And that's the big one. That's going to be really significant, right? If your property is, let's say, worth more or not very impacted economically, then you're going to have a very uphill battle establishing a takings claim, because takings by law, courts have said they should be functionally equivalent, should be a severe economic impact. It's functionally equivalent to eminent domain. The second element that courts will look at, and this is a question of law, whether or not a taking occurred is something a court will determine is a question of law. The second element is, what's the extent of interference with your reasonable investment-backed expectations? And I think this is sort of really interesting in the groundwater regulatory field. Someone is using their property for, let's say, a cattle operation, and they have windmill wells all over their property. And then governmental regulation goes into effect, and they can still do that, but they can't do something different. They can't change the use. Well, courts will look at what was your reasonable expectation, and it should be investment backed. So reasonable investment backed expectation. And what that really means is, if all you've ever done is use your property for a cattle operation, but then the rules change on you, where have you shown that you had that there was interference with your investment in your property? And so the example I gave you is probably not going to have the best takings claim. On the other hand, let's say I buy a piece of property to develop for a real estate subdivision, and that's what I'm planning to do, and I've started the work on that, and then governmental regulation comes in and restricts my ability to do what I'm planning to do. Now that's a different issue, and it's going to be a much more strong case of interference with reasonable investment-backed expectations, right? And these are fact questions that courts will look at. Okay, the third element is the character of the governmental action. It's sort of the most nebulous factor. A couple of things that were said earlier in the call sort of were on this, if you will, they were sort of related to this element. So this is courts looking at what government did. It isn't a due process analysis of whether governmental action is reasonable, but it's the less articulated element of the takings law. And essentially, courts have said that it's okay to regulate groundwater. It's okay to limit production. It's okay to take into account other factors when acting. For instance, someone brought up all the different provisions of Chapter 36 that are to be considered when permitting decisions are made, when DFCs are set. So all that sort of stuff would go into this character of the governmental action. Historically, courts did use a sort of due process analysis on this factor, where they looked to see whether the governmental action was unfairly motivated, was somehow improper, or sus some way. But that's mostly fallen out of the analysis in courts. There haven't been a whole lot more on that. So that's sort of the more nebulous factor. But anyway, so this is all going to be a balancing act, where courts look at all of these elements and say, is there enough here? Is the effect on you so significant that it warrants having compensation? And in which case, if a court finds that as a matter of law, there's a taking that has occurred, well, finds this question of law that the taking has occurred, then it could go to the jury or to a judge to determine, well, what's the amount of compensation that's adequate under the Texas Constitution, or just is the language under the federal Constitution, and they're the same. So what's just compensation for the extent of the invasion of your property? And there's also a less developed area of takings law that has to do with temporary takings, and that's a shorter 2-year statute of limitations, and looks at what is the before and after. It could be determined by rental value. So for instance, I have a different client in New Mexico who was prevented by some really poor inspectors and governmental entities from using their property for the business they had intended to do. And it caused them to, basically the inspectors and folks didn't know what the rules were and misinterpreted them. And our client went forward with the construction of their, on their property. And then, you know, a year later, we're told, oops, we were wrong. We got it wrong. Go back and undo everything you did. Redo all of your construction. And so they've brought a takings claim against the government in that case. And arguably the proper solution to it is figuring out what they're out for their lost income during that piece of time that they were unable to use their property for its intended purpose. So that's kind of the big picture. You know, they're complicated cases because they do require establishing before and after values. I'll tell you something else that's come up in this really large litigation that we're working on right now, is that it's often very confusing who owns what. Who are the property owners when you've got, you know, estates and inheritances and in particular mineral interests. And we see that a lot less with groundwater, but remember, groundwater rights can be severed just like mineral rights can be severed in Texas. If all you have in property is a groundwater right, and that groundwater right is what is impacted. So that's your only stick that you own. You don't have the fee plus groundwater and minerals and everything else. You just have a groundwater interest. Then that is what the court would look at. What's the extent of economic impact to just that one interest? But generally, the rule is parcel as a whole. So we're going to look at the entirety of your ownership and how much it is impacted. So that's probably a good stopping point. If there's anything else I can clarify, happy to.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? I know I kind of have a hypothetical that I'm interested in, but I'll open the floor to other folks first.
Deborah, this is Zach. First of all, really want to commend and appreciate your time and effort in putting this together for us and laying out a really well thought up and kind of broad-based approach on kind of hitting all the highlights of this topic. One question I had is, do you have kind of a general bullet point outline of this that we could include in our kind of the record for reference? The good thing is in the virtual world, we are recording everything, so we'll have it, but just curiosity.
Oh, I'm sure I have papers or something I can send over.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate it, ma'am.
Deborah, I've got a hypothetical. A homeowner has an investment-backed expectation to their home and live in it safely, soundly, not have the ground sink out from under it, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Groundwater District issued a permit to another entity, and it was that entity's pumping that caused subsidence. Does that homeowner have a potential takings claim against the groundwater district?
Yes, they do. Is it a good one? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it sounds like you've got causation arguments and maybe, you know, because you can't sue a private property owner for the same cause of action. You can't sue another private property owner for a takings or a business or whatever for a takings, but you might have some other cause of action that's a tort against that business, right? So a government may be able to come in with some defenses that it wasn't really our regulation as much as assuming there even is found to be a taking. It really wasn't our fault. It was the company's fault, and they should pay in negligence or nuisance or some other common law theory. But, you know, all to get the takings recovery, all those elements would have to be established, right? There'd have to be enough there. But yeah, I mean, you asked, is there a potential takings claim on those facts? I'd say yes, there is.
Thank you. Any other questions for Ms. Trejo?
John, would it be okay for me to ask one question?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so again, I appreciate the presentation as well. I had a quick question. In regards to takings, you know, we're doing a joint planning process here, and then there are district rules that are adopted consistent with the DFCs. Is it the volume of water available, you know, the MAG that comes out of this process that would determine whether a taking has taken place, or is it the implementation of the DFCs and district rules that would determine that?
Right. It's definitely what is the regulatory action vis-a-vis the landowner, right? So it would be, you'd have to find what's the governmental action. And I would say potentially, you know, the landowner could challenge the adoption of the MAG or the DFC, but it's going to be how it impacts their property. So the general rule, if it doesn't immediately cause any change to the landowner, it would be like a subsequent rule that says you can't get a permit because of the MAG, right? So it's once that, and then there's case law on this. It's sort of once it becomes clear, this is what the standard is. Once it becomes clear how a regulatory scheme impacts your ability to use your property as a property owner, that's when the regulatory taking occurs. And that's when the statute of limitations begins to run on the regulatory taking. And by the way, courts, there isn't a statutory statute of limitations in Texas for regulatory takings, but courts have applied a 10-year statute of limitations by analogy. And this is a sort of just from the regulatory point of view, it's important to have a fairly well-established regulatory scheme that sets forth for folks kind of what the rules are, because then the clock begins to tick and the regulatory scheme is clear as to them. So that impacts your investment-backed expectations, right? Like if they're already, it is clear you're going to be regulated and you're going to be limited and it's coming down the line, right? It's 80% this year, it's going down to 70, it's going to 60. Then you as a landowner cannot have a reasonable investment-backed expectation that you get to use 100% of it, right? So I think keeping those things in mind, that the longer your scheme, regulatory scheme sits out there, the less potential claims there are. And when we're looking at it from the plaintiff's point of view, at what point did they acquire their investment-backed expectations? Because it should be prior to, like when they purchased the property is normally what we're going to look at. What was the what rules were in effect when you bought the property? And if y'all have followed, there's a City of Houston case that's been up and down the courts, up and down the courts, up and down the courts around drilling an oil well. And that case is really interesting because Houston told the landowner that they couldn't drill a well, but they actually could, and the rule expired. And you know, there's all these sort of interesting facts, but it helps you understand that what's important for a landowner is be able to rely on what are the rules, right? If I'm a business, I need to have rules and to know how to operate. If you keep changing them on me, then that's a problem, right? So the longer we can have clear rules that set out whatever our limitations are, then folks know they can act accordingly, and then that's going to limit takings claims.
Thank you.
I've got another question that was posted via way of chat that it asks, what does a takings suit look like and what evidence must be presented on both sides?
Well, it's sort of what I was talking about before. I don't know that I need to super belabor it, but you know, it's going to be a fact intensive. So and I'm talking about regulatory takings, not physical taking where it's really clear and, you know, here's the before and after, or but where we're going to have to establish what were the rules in effect, when did I buy my property, what were my expectations, and then what's the valuation before and after of my property, before and after the regulation impacted it. So it's going to require expert witnesses. Usually to establish that, it's going to be lengthy, it's going to be fact intensive, it's going to have lots of discovery. It's not likely to be a super clean, easy, cheap lawsuit. It's going to be expensive for everybody.
Zach, did I interrupt you? Look like maybe you were going to ask another question? No? Anybody else have a question? Okay, that being said, we're about an hour and a half into this, and I think it might be a good point to take a 5-minute break, give or take. Everybody scoot on back as soon as you can with your fresh cups of coffee, and we'll see you in a few.
All right, thank y'all. Y'all take care.
Thank you, Deborah.
All right.
Thank you,
bye.
Megan.
What on earth is that? Looks like everybody is filing back in.
John, quick screen check. Are you seeing my presentation?
I am.
Great, thank you.
See, Mike, is the meeting still recording and whatnot, Mike? Or whoever's running the meeting, I should say.
It is.
Thank you for taking care of all this for us, whoever that is in the background. Is Ms. Trejo still on the line?
Mr. Martin, she is no longer on the attendee list.
Okie dokie, thank you.
You're welcome.
Somebody shot me a question by way of the chat feature that I did not see until just a moment ago. So I apologize for that, and I'll give her a shout and see if I can do follow-up on it. And the question, FYI, was if groundwater pumping results in surface water in rivers or streams recharging an aquifer, does the surface water loss constitute a taking? Extremely interesting question.
Hey, John, this is Mike Turco. Can I make a quick comment?
Sure.
Yeah, just so everybody knows that when we go on a break, because we may have another break later on, that the recording is still going, and you might want to mute yourself during the break, just in case you have to make a quick call or something to follow up on somebody during the break. So anyway, just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that tapes are still rolling, even though we're filling our coffee cup.
Good to know, Mike. Much appreciated. So why don't we get kicked off here with agenda item 8. Presentation, discussion, and consideration of the impact on the interests and rights of private property, including ownership and the rights of management area landowners and their lessees and assigns in groundwater as recognized under section 3602 as required by Texas Water Code 36108D7, including presentations by several legal experts as well as the GMA consultants. What I would like to do is start off with Wade's presentation. He promised me it would be brief. Then I was thinking Mr. Jones, followed by Mr. Ellis, followed by Ms. Reese, followed by Mr. Hill, if that's okay. And that being said, the ball is yours, Wade.
I appreciate that, John. I will keep to my word to keep this brief, and I appreciate also you separating me out as not a legal expert in your introduction, because that is for sure the case, and I'm going to stay in my lane as we go through here. But my role here, as I see it at least, is to introduce the topic of the consideration of interests and rights in private property as it relates to the joint planning process, where that factor fits in, and essentially we're pointing you to a few what seem to be key parts of the water code related to this factor, and a couple of the more technical items that you all as a GMA have reviewed already that you may want to keep in mind when considering this factor. So it's one of the 9 factors. We only have 2 left, and that'll be at the next meeting. Any other relevant information, just for folks on the call, will include faults in the GMA. So private property impacts, this is how it's articulated within Chapter 36 of the Water Code, that the districts within the GMA are to consider the impact on the interests and rights in private property including ownership and the rights of management area landowners and their lessees and assigns in groundwater as recognized under section 36002. So going over to 36002, this is that section. The text is very small, so I've broken it up into a few digestible bites here. So 36002A is that the legislature recognizes that a landowner owns the groundwater below the surface of the landowner's land as real property. Okay. B is that the groundwater ownership and rights described by the section entitle the landowner to drill for and produce groundwater below the surface of real property, subject to subsection D, so going on below, without causing waste or malicious drainage or negligently causing subsidence, and then have any other right recognized under common law. So that's sort of the property rights piece. It also goes on to clarify that this section does not entitle the landowner to the right to capture a specific amount of water below the landowner's land or affect common law defenses to liability under the rule of capture. C is that nothing in the code shall be construed as granting the authority to deprive or divest a landowner of the groundwater ownership and rights described in this section. But and then as we go on to D, this gets into the some of the relationship between groundwater management and private property rights, that the ownership of groundwater does not prohibit a district from limiting or prohibiting the drilling of a well for failure to, or inability to comply with minimum well spacing or tract size requirements, or affect the ability of the district to regulate groundwater, or require the district rules proportion availability equally based on the area owned by the landowner. Okay. And then finally, E, since this is relevant to GMA 14, is that this section does not affect the ability to regulate groundwater in these three special purpose districts, which include the Harris-Galveston Subsidence District and the Fort Bend Subsidence District. So I bring all those up because that is really the, those are really the Chapter 36 considerations as it's spelled out right there. And I want to remind everybody that as we're considering the impacts on the interests and rights in private property, that we're doing so for a few, for three specific scenarios that the GMA is looking at potentially proposing as desired future conditions. So this is the multi-factor results or multi-factor DFCs that we've talked about before. So there's the two of the scenarios have no less than 70% median available drawdown remaining. One of the scenarios has no less than 80% median available drawdown remaining, and then all three have no more than 1 foot of average additional subsidence. And then to augment in areas where the demand for water, at least as spelled out in the regional water planning process, is low relative to these impacts. We, for the purposes of developing MAGs and doing this evaluation, we have capped the pumping input to the model at 30,000 acre feet per year above the maximum projected water demand in that county over the planning period. So that's how we get to three different scenarios, and the results and impacts that I'm going to show right now are things that you all have seen before, just in a different graphical form. So this is a comparison between the maximum demand from the regional water planning process. This is the demands that would go into the 2022 state water plan. And so that's the blue bar for each of these counties. And I'll say I don't have Harris, Galveston, or Fort Bend counties on this on these charts because those counties by definition don't have DFCs or MAGs. So you can see the relationship between the pumping in each county in each of the scenarios, which are these 3 colors down here, compared to the maximum demand over the planning period. Okay. Montgomery County was brought up a lot in the public comments this morning. I'll note that this 80% run is similar. It's not the same, but it's similar in magnitude. It's about 61,000 acre feet per year. So that's substantially different than these other two in regards to the pumping level in Montgomery County. In terms of average additional subsidence, these are the values for each of the scenarios. And so you can see some of these cap out right at 1 foot, which means that that's the limiting factor for the DFC in those counties. And then finally, the median available drawdown remaining. And so you can see some of these, that it's 80%, some of them are 70%. And then those counties that do not have a distribution like this means that they're limited by one of the other factors, whether it's the regional water planning demand or it's the median available drawdown remaining. And I bring this up because a lot of the analysis that we've done so far relates to the impact on existing wells and landowners in the area. And so I would, if I understand this right, and I'll defer to the attorneys to clarify my definitions here, but to me that seems like the interests in private property piece of it. Okay. And then what I think of as rights in private property perhaps that's more focused on the right to produce groundwater. And so I'm interested in something I will be listening for in the presentations to come are the difference between the interest in private property and the rights in private property, if there is one. And then getting back to some of the 36002 items from earlier on, that if your view is that private property rights are absolutely the paramount factor for consideration, what is a reasonable approach for groundwater management? So that's what I'll be looking for, and happy to answer questions, but this was meant primarily as an introduction.
Thank you, Wade. Anybody have any questions for him before we move on? Hearing or seeing none. Mr. Marty Jones, how are you this morning?
I'm well, yourself?
Not bad at all, sir. Thank you for asking. Mike, the floor is yours.
May I share my screen?
Please, if I don't know how quite to do that, but Mike said that you should be able to do so, so please.
I'm sorry, I'm just not seeing a way to do that from my end.
They'll have to allow that here.
Yeah. So the staff will undo Wade and then add you. Yeah.
Okay.
Is my screen sharing?
Should we be seeing Strata versus Brazos Valley?
Yes, it is. Okay, so any discussion of private property rights is contemplated, I think, under this factor, has to start with a clear understanding that Texas law is that the landowner owns the groundwater in place under his property, unless, of course, it's been severed. That's stated in the Texas Water Code at 36.002. It was the subject of Edwards Aquifer Authority versus Day, which, of course, the EAA lost. It's been subject of the Bragg case, which the EAA lost. This is on the screen a more recent case that folks might not be aware of because it was in the federal court system out of a case in Waco. Strata versus Brazos Valley Groundwater Conservation District the Fifth Circuit handed down an opinion earlier this year in which one of the questions was, should a federal court take jurisdiction of the case? The groundwater district said that the court should not take jurisdiction because a federal court should not inject itself into an area where Texas law, where state law is not clear. And there might be some doubt about what Texas law or state law might be. The Fifth Circuit handled that in that first quote. It says the Texas Supreme Court plainly held in Day that a landowner's property rights include the ownership of groundwater and place beneath his acreage, and such ownership right is subject to takings claims. The court stated at the outset that it would decide in this case whether land ownership includes an interest in groundwater in place that cannot be taken for public use without adequate compensation guaranteed by the Texas Constitution. We hold that it does. And then Judge Edith Jones, who's not really known for her humor on the court, in the next paragraph posed this question: what is unsettled about Day's interpretation of the common law and statutory rights of groundwater owners? In other words, she's saying the court didn't understand why there's even a question about the ownership and rights of groundwater owners in Texas. And ultimately, throughout the opinion, the court referred to the groundwater district's arguments as, in one place, virtually frivolous, and in another place as a bright red herring. So I think it's safe to say after the Strata decision that all groundwater district boards of directors are on notice that the law is clear in Texas, it's settled in Texas, there are rights in groundwater that cannot be ignored or taken. And part of that opinion dealt with whether the groundwater district directors enjoyed what's called qualified immunity from liability for their actions. And the court, of course, said they could be. And that's a question in large part on what they knew, whether a reasonably prudent person in their position would have known that the actions they took were wrong. And so part of this discussion relates to saying clearly, if you engage in a taking, a reasonably prudent member of a board of directors of a groundwater conservation district should know that's wrong. And that's what the court seems to be directing us toward. Now, if we look at the question of, and I see a lot of discussion this morning about subsidence. And if we look at that question, then I direct your attention to Friendswood Development Company versus Smith Southwest Industries, Texas Supreme Court, 1978. The development company was causing some subsidence out there in the southeast area of Harris and Galveston counties, and there was a lawsuit brought over it. The Supreme Court cited what's called the Restatement of Torts, Section 818. That says, to the extent that a person is not liable for withdrawing subterranean waters from the land of another, he is not liable for a subsidence of the other's land which is caused by the withdrawal. The Supreme Court went on to say that statement in Section 818 of the Restatement of Torts fairly represents the law on the subject as pronounced in common law jurisdictions. The court then pointed out that in 1840, Texas adopted the common law of England, and then the court said, we found nothing in our Constitution, laws, or decisions inconsistent with the common law rule. On the contrary, our decisions in East and City of Pleasanton and Williams denying liability for damages to neighboring property because of lowering the water tables beneath neighboring lands are consistent with the rule as stated above. The court took, I thought, an extraordinary step in 1978 and said that's the law in the past, The law in the future in Texas is going to be that you cannot negligently withdraw groundwater and cause subsidence without liability. And we find that incorporated in the Texas Water Code provisions, which prohibit negligently withdrawing groundwater and causing subsidence thereby. But it's important to know that there's a difference here between constitutionally protected property rights in groundwater and a potential claim for negligently withdrawing groundwater and causing subsidence. One is a constitutionally protected right. The other, I think, as Mr. Oliver may have asked, is more of an interest in the property. And by that I mean this: if you have property where subsidence has been caused by someone negligently withdrawing groundwater, then there might be a claim under negligence law for the damages that arguably are done by that. If a groundwater district engages in a taking, then you don't have to prove negligently taking, you just prove taking. It's a constitutionally protected right. So, this kind of illustrates what we're talking about. Constitutionally protected rights on one hand, if we're striking a balance, ownership of groundwater as real property is a constitutionally protected right. Not constitutionally protected, and we hear this from time to time in groundwater districts, we want to protect artesian pressure. We want to protect water levels in wellbores. We want to make sure that everybody has low production costs, that they don't have to drill new wells, that they don't have to lower their wells. And now we're hearing we want protection from subsidence. Those are not constitutionally protected rights. And so if we're looking at that balance, you can consider these other things, you can talk about these other things, but one of them is constitutionally protected property rights. The others might be, I guess, interests that people have. Now, are these rights inconsistent? Groundwater districts have the right to regulate the production of groundwater. That is absolutely clear. It comes with the police power of the state government. The GMAs have to consider subsidence in connection with establishing DFCs. That's what the statute says. That's what you're required to do. But by the same token, landowners have this constitutionally protected right in groundwater. Are those things inconsistent with each other? And I would say that they're not really inconsistent. GMA 14 could set a DFC for that entire district, for the entire area, that says that there will be no subsidence occurring anywhere in any district in GMA 14. The groundwater districts could halt all production of groundwater from the Gulf Coast aquifer to achieve that DFC. That's a power that you would have. But the trouble is, of course, that the groundwater conservation district would have to compensate landowners for the groundwater that would be condemned by that kind of action. And so the simple question is an economic one. And it is, if we want to stop all subsidence because there's an economic issue there, and that's what I think what we're talking about, is that economic issue sufficiently articulated? Is it big enough? Is it important enough that we're willing to pay for the groundwater that we have to leave in the ground in order to do that? And what we're talking about here is that the groundwater district would have the power, in essence, to condemn groundwater in place for a public purpose. That public purpose would be articulated as stopping subsidence. And so you say, okay, there's a public interest in stopping subsidence. We have the power to stop production of groundwater in order to do that. But you have to compensate the landowners for the value of the groundwater that's being taken away from them to accomplish that public purpose. That's the Fifth Amendment U.S. Constitution. You can't take private property for public purposes without compensation. And so, yeah, the balance that you could strike there is largely an economic balance, and it depends on what you want to pay for it. There was a question asked earlier, could a groundwater conservation district be liable for subsidence if the groundwater district doesn't crank back on production enough? I would argue that it cannot be. It's a discretionary thing with a groundwater conservation district as to how much, if at all, you want to regulate the production. It is not one of the activities of a governmental entity that's mandatory. And I'm thinking now of maybe a liquor license, where if the applicant checks all the boxes, then the regulatory agency must issue a license, and the failure to do so might be, might subject them to some kind of liability. Here, you don't have to regulate production. You don't have to crank it back to a certain extent. That's within your discretion. And I don't find any cases where a regulatory body has been held liable for property damage that resulted from not taking a discretionary regulatory step. I don't think a groundwater conservation district that fails, as it were, to regulate production enough could be responsible for damages caused by subsidence. On the same level, however, the case law makes it abundantly clear that you can be liable for taking if you regulate the production too much. Mr. Oliver didn't provide this earlier, but it is a comparison of the current to potential future mags that was done by probably Mr. Intera and Mr. Oliver at Intera. You'll note that the groundwater production in GMA 14 area is predominantly in Harris and Fort Bend counties. It is not predominantly in Montgomery County, although we hear a great deal of discussion about that. And so the only other thing I would say is if we're talking about private property rights and we're looking at Fort Bend County and we're looking at Harris County producing a great amount more of groundwater, and that's in their plans. And by the way, subsidence is permitted under their long-range plans. If we're looking at those issues and you're saying, well, we ought to really crank back on Montgomery County, unless you crank back equally on Harris County, which is producing from the same aquifers, then you get into a situation where you've got disparate regulation of the same aquifer by different governmental entities, which could also be regarded as a taking. In fact, Mars versus Railroad Commission addresses that very proposition, where the Railroad Commission had used differing regulatory amounts on either side of a line they arbitrarily drew across an oil field. And the Texas Supreme Court in that case said that's a violation of equal protection. It's a violation of the takings clause. The Railroad Commission didn't have that authority, and I don't think the groundwater districts would have that authority either. That applies to Harris County, Fort Bend County. That applies to all the counties in GMA 14 where there might be differing regulatory constraints on production across an imaginary county line. And so, I think in conclusion, I would simply state that you need to consider the value of groundwater rights that you might be condemning if you put too much regulation on the ability to use that groundwater. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Does anybody have a question for him? I know I have one.
Mr. Martin, there are some attendees who also have written some questions in the question box.
In the question box. How do I get to a question box? To organizers, audio, webcam, chat. Is that the same as the chat? Oh, there. Questions. There we go. I see Mr. Gaynor has submitted one, but I'm not seeing how to. Just says thank you. Keep this open. Got one question. It looks like it says define negligence. I'm not sure if that was specifically meant for you, Mr. Jones, but
I'd be happy to define negligence. I deal with it from time to time. Negligence is doing something that a reasonably prudent person would not do under the same or similar circumstances, or failing to do something that a reasonably prudent person would do under the same or similar circumstances.
okay. Don't know what I did, but boom, things went from one tiny little line to I've got a real paragraph. Okay, next question. So it looks like it's going to be similar. What defines negligence if you know that subsidence will occur and you deliberately cause it by pumping too much water? Is that not negligence?
That, I think, raises an interesting question of a different concept called negligence per se. And let's say that that you have placed a specific, limit on what a well can produce, and let's say that it's 3,000 gallons a minute, and some well owner is producing at 6,000 gallons a minute, which would be remarkable, of course. But they're violating your regulation when they do that. And there is a branch of negligence law called negligence per se that says if you're violating a statute that is designed to protect against a particular result, and the person who is harmed is within the the zone of people who are designed to be protected by that statute, then you can be liable without proof of what a reasonably prudent person would do, because you're violating the statute. And so what we're talking about there is, yes, I think there could be a negligent production of groundwater if it's in violation of a regulatory scheme.
Okay. Okay, see, I have any questions? Thank you. Define negligence. See, does this call into question why we even have groundwater conservation districts in GMAs? I think that's a general question.
I think I heard you say, why have groundwater districts?
No, it's the person's question is states, it's more of a statement. Does this call into question about why we even have groundwater conservation districts in groundwater management areas?
Well, I think that groundwater conservation districts have a useful place in the regulatory scheme, and that is to, for example, prevent interference between wells, so that if I'm sitting next to John Martin's tract of land, I don't put in a big well and interfere with his wells or interfere with his rights. I think groundwater conservation districts usefully function to modify the rule of capture so that there is a regulatory scheme that helps ensure that everybody has a fair opportunity to produce a fair share of the water. I think it's important for groundwater districts to regulate permitting and well drilling so that wells are drilled in an orderly way and are drilled in such a way that they don't damage the aquifer. I also believe that production limits are useful to help preserve the integrity of an aquifer, perhaps to preserve it into the future, recognizing, of course, that you always have to adhere to the notion that folks own that groundwater. And let me just move over to the oil and gas context in that regard. I think we would find it surprising that the Railroad Commission would say to Exxon that you can't produce the oil in this oil field because we want it to be preserved for your great grandchildren. I think Exxon would correctly sue over that kind of regulatory scheme. By the same token, if a groundwater district puts into effect, as many have, a production limit that is based on correlative rights so that everybody's subject to the same regulation, everybody is entitled to the same correlative production, then what you're doing is ensuring that everybody has a fair opportunity to produce a fair share of the water in that aquifer based on some metric that's measurable. Then I think, you know, that's one of the functions of groundwater conservation districts. So no, I'm not calling into question why we have groundwater conservation districts. I'm just calling into question the nature and extent of the regulation that might be undertaken.
I've got a question, but it looks like I have a couple others on here. I'd like to get mine in real quick. How does the average landowner throughout a GMA, GCD, or even county who owns a property, owns their home, owns their land, and didn't, when they purchased it, didn't have any specific intent to utilize that water other than basic domestic water? How does, when it comes to a takings claim, how doesn't the investment-backed expectation play into the average landowner? I mean, if they bought a piece of property and didn't initially intend on utilizing that property for anything other than a home site, then down the line they decide, after, you know, we've got groundwater districts in place now for decades, now they decide they want to sell water. How does that play with the average person?
And you know, in all due respect to the 10 central factors, and that's what we're talking about here, is this reasonable investment-backed expectation statement that we find, for example, in the Bragg case. I think, you know, that's going to be the subject of some discussion in the future because of what you just mentioned. And that is, let's say that I own a tract of land, 100 acres, and when I bought it 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and not pick on Conroe, but you know, it grows like a cancer. Let's say that I was 10 miles away from Conroe and the highest and best use of my land was hunting, because you know, it's got woods. I can't use the water for agriculture. I can't use the water for anything but domestic and livestock use. And that's what I think you've mentioned, John. Okay. And let's say that Conroe in the next 20 years after I bought it grows my direction so that now it's right next to me. And let's assume that Conroe needs water and they're looking for water rights. And, you know, what I'm saying is the situation has changed and the circumstances have changed. I didn't have that expectation when I bought it. Mm-hmm. I need to explore the possibilities of selling that water to let's say a municipal water supplier. But the Groundwater Conservation District, for some reason, either denies me a permit or limits me in such a way that right is not as valuable to me as it could be if my neighbor had the same permit. I think those circumstances would kind of move the analysis of the reasonable investment back expectations to a different level. I don't think the fact that I purchased it 20 years ago and there was no use for the water at that time, there was no market for the water at that time, I don't think that's going to allow a taking to take place that's uncompensated.
I have it looks like one more question. If a neighbor takes so much water from his property that it depletes water on my property, is that not an unlawful taking of my property? And I think that's pretty much a simple answer. You want to answer that, Mr. Jones?
That's the rule of capture. 1904, the East case, where the Texas Supreme Court said, look, you know, if you produce water on your land and it makes the neighbor's well go dry, that's the rule of capture says there's no liability for that.
And takings claims, correct me if I'm wrong, are very specifically toward governmental agencies taking away property?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Can't sue an individual for taking because individual's not a government. Unless you happen to be Jeff Bezos.
Any of the GMA members or interlocal participants have a question for Mr. Jones?
Hey, John, I have a question. I believe in the definition of negligence, Mr. Jones said reasonably prudent. Do we have a definition for that? Reasonably specifically. I know a lot of
the word reasonable.
No.
Like no longer reasonable DFCs.
Yeah.
Not really. You know, juries are left to determine what reasonably prudent means in a specific context because it's very fact-specific inquiry. And I'll just say that there are a lot of definitions that flow through that question of negligence, one of which is proximate cause. And nobody understands proximate cause. If you see the definition is given to a jury, you'd scratch your head and say, how am I supposed to understand that? But the lawyers don't understand it either, so you shouldn't feel alone.
Okay. Moving along, assuming nobody else has a question, and I'm seeing none. Mr. Ellis, are you available out there?
I am.
Fired up. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, I hope everybody can see my screen. It should say property rights and groundwater law. Is that working?
Yes, sir. Yes, we got it.
Okay, some of these you've already heard. I hate to repeat, so I maybe skip through some of these slides fairly quickly. Obviously, we start with the rule of capture that came from the English common law doctrine and adopted by the Texas Supreme Court in the East case in 1904. It was reaffirmed several times since, most recently in 1997 in the Ozarka case. And under that law, the surface estate owner has the right to pump groundwater from beneath the surface of his or her surface estate, regardless of any potential damage that might be done to their neighboring properties. It's also called the rule of the biggest pump. One cannot win a suit against his or her neighbor for injunctive relief or damages resulting from the neighbor's depletion of groundwater resources, except in the case where the person pumping it is wasting it. The person is pumping it with a malicious intent to purposely injure the neighbor, or as Marty just mentioned, since 1978, since if they have negligently pumped that water and caused subsidence. So here's the only solution you have under the rule of capture is a conversation with your neighbor. There are the question of ownership has been brought up before the legislature and the courts. The legislature in chapters 35 and 36 of the Texas Water Code provide for the regulation of groundwater and groundwater conservation districts. And 36002 sets out the ownership of groundwater. I think you've already heard this as well. The legislature recognizes that a landowner owns the groundwater below the surface of the landowner's land as real property. And this section does not affect the ability of a district to regulate groundwater production as authorized by this chapter. The case law, and I think this is probably the best statement of it. This is actually from the Day case that quoted the Ella versus Texon drilling case from 1949, which was an oil and gas case. And what I've done here is replaced every place they were talking about oil and gas with the word groundwater, because I think this is a proper statement of the current ownership interest in groundwater. In our state, the landowner is regarded as having absolute title in severalty to the groundwater in place beneath his land. The only qualification of that rule of ownership is that it must be considered in connection with the law of capture and is subject to police regulations. The groundwater beneath the soil is considered a part of the realty. Each owner of land owns separately, distinctly, and exclusively all the groundwater under his land and is accorded the usual remedies against trespassers who appropriate the groundwater or destroy its market value. Now, those trespassers they're talking about is not someone who is pumping their own well so much that it's pulling water from your land. That's what's protected by the rule of capture. I get to take the water from beneath your land as long as I don't trespass to do that. Trespass might be if I do a horizontal well or a slant well and actually drill my well onto your property. Or I could cause a trespass by polluting your groundwater. If I have a pollution plume under my property that moves onto your property, I've caused a trespass and destroyed the value of your groundwater. Interestingly, fracking under the oil and gas scenario in Coastal Oil versus Garza, the Supreme Court held that fracking was not a trespass. Even if they could prove the fractures extended beyond the property line, the court said it still doesn't matter. That's not a trespass. There we go. So, because groundwater is privately owned, the groundwater conservation districts are created to protect and prevent the harms that would be allowed by the rule of capture. And they must protect three distinct groups of property rights owners. First are those well owners who have been and continue to produce groundwater. And I would label them as those who have investment-backed expectations, clear investment-backed expectations, because they put money into drilling a well, potentially storage tanks, maybe distribution systems, treatment systems. There's quite a bit there that can be invested in being able to produce a certain amount of groundwater. Two, applicants who desire to produce the groundwater of the future. I bought the property with the intent to produce groundwater for some purpose, whether it's marketing, pecan orchards, or starting a day camp for Boy Scouts. It doesn't matter. If I had intended to produce groundwater as part of my plan, and I can show through investment-backed expectations what those intentions were, then I have that property interest. I have that. There's a level of protection due there. And then third, the landowners who do not own a well and do not have any current plans to drill a well, but nevertheless want to protect their groundwater. There are a number of landowners that believe they own the groundwater beneath their property, and therefore any loss of that water, any loss of potentiometric surface beneath their property should be compensable. And so we'll have to see court cases, which of these situations might actually result in taking liability to a groundwater conservation district or a city or county or whoever happens to try and regulate. It's not just groundwater districts that regulate groundwater. Try and drill a well in Austin sometime. In the Day case, this is Day McDaniel versus the Edwards Aquifer Authority, where they had requested a permit from the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and the permit was not denied. It was granted, but for much less water than they had demanded. They essentially demanded 2 acre-foot of groundwater in their permit for every acre of land they owned. They ended up with 14 acre-feet, not the 800 acre-feet they had requested. And so they filed this lawsuit. The trial court decided that the ownership interest in groundwater was so nebulous that it could not represent a vested property right that could be the subject of a takings claim. That eventually ended up before the Texas Supreme Court. And this quote is directly from the opinion of the Texas Supreme Court. As with oil and gas, one purpose of groundwater regulation is to afford each owner of water in a common subsurface reservoir a fair share. Now, I don't know where the court got that from. It's not in the statute, but this is now part of the common law, so that is the law. Because a reservoir supply of oil or gas cannot generally be replenished, and because oil and gas production is most commonly used solely as a commodity for sale, land surface area is an important metric in determining an owner's fair share. Reasonable regulation aims at allowing an owner to withdraw the volume beneath his property and sell it. Groundwater is different. Aquifers are often recharged by rainfall, drainage, or other surface water. The amount of groundwater beneath the surface may increase as well as decrease. Any volume associated with the surface is constantly changing. Groundwater's many beneficial uses for drinking, agriculture, industry, and recreation often do not involve the sale of water. Its value is realized not only in personal consumption, but through crops, products, and diversion. Groundwater may be used entirely on the land from which it is pumped, or it may be transported for use or sale elsewhere. Consequently, regulation that affords an owner a fair share of subsurface water must take into account factors other than surface area. So here the court has once again, just as it did in the East case, where it rejected the idea that the amount of groundwater you're entitled to produce correlates to the amount of land you own. They have again rejected that even as regulatory bodies, we need to look beyond the correlative right of how much water you own depends on how much surface acreage you own. Now let's compare that to the Mars case that Marty just mentioned. In Mars, the court said, the trial court here found that the drainage complained of was not necessary in order to avoid waste, and that finding is supported by the evidence. It was further found that the orders of the Railroad Commission were unreasonable, unjust, and discriminatory. This court has many times said the Railroad Commission cannot indulge in unjust, unreasonable, or arbitrary discrimination between different oil fields or between different owners in the same field. The evidence that was presented in that case and in the opinion from the Supreme Court stated that we're looking at a situation where, as we're watching the pressure levels drop in this formation, the surface sustained owners are not able to obtain the same amount of oil and gas. They can't reasonably produce the amount that they should be able to produce in order to maintain an equal fair share capture of that oil and gas. And that's a problem because once the oil and gas is gone, it's gone. It'll never come back. There's nothing to recharge it. It's not going to flow back in from the surface or from any other formation. So in order to protect the rights of the owners in their fair share of that formation, that's where this court held in Mars, that there had to be a consideration between landowners over the same field. Further, they said this is not a case of mere waste in which the commission has exercised the sound discretion invested in it to conserve our natural resources. As previously stated, the orders of the Railroad Commission here complained of have the effect of taking one's property and giving it to another under circumstances where the evidence shows that this is not necessary in order to conserve the natural resources. Well, that certainly implies that where it is necessary to conserve the natural resources, having such an order would be appropriate. Comparing Mars, again, the conclusions you can draw from this, the Mars Court's holding is based on whether the Railroad Commission's decision was to prevent waste or to conserve natural resources, and they determined it was not. The evidence showed that the Railroad Commission decision allowed oil to drain from the plaintiff's property and permanently reduce pressure within the formation, which is not likely to happen anywhere in the Gulf Coast aquifer. There may be aquifers across the state where that would apply, and in that case, I think you have to be very careful about what rules you adopt. I don't think that's the case with the Gulf Coast aquifer. And the court's ruling invalidated the decision. It did not find that there was taking liability to TRC. It simply said, because your rule is not based on preventing waste or protecting natural resources, the rule itself is invalid. And so they have, I'm sorry, I keep saying rule. I think it was actually a permitting decision or a rule specific to that field. So in the Day case in 2012, the Supreme Court held that landowners own groundwater in place similar to the ownership of oil and gas. However, unquestionably, this is a quote, the state is empowered to regulate groundwater production, and regulation is essential to its, meaning groundwater, conservation and use. So whether there is a compensable taking of a groundwater right depends upon a complex analysis under the takings test established by the U.S. Supreme Court and the Texas Supreme Court. The next case that came up was Bragg versus EAA, again, the Edwards Aquifer Authority, where Glenn and Jolyn Bragg, they're commercial pecan growers who were denied a water permit for one of their pecan orchards and granted a limited permit for another of their pecan orchards. That was not enough for them to be able to economically continue their pecan business, or at least all of their pecan business. The Braggs successfully sued the Edwards Aquifer Authority, and Roland Ruiz, in his official capacity as the general manager of the authority, not personal liability, but as an official capacity, for an alleged taking of their property, and they obtained a judgment awarding them damages. The check that was written to the Braggs eventually amounted to $4.5 million. They were denied. On appeal to the Fourth Court of Appeals, they overruled the district court after the Day case came out and remanded the case for trial on the takings claim. The Fourth Court, in its opinion, held first that there's a 10-year statute of limitation that begins to run when the regulation takes effect, that the court must follow the Penn Central from the U.S. Supreme Court and Sheffield from the Texas Supreme Court factors to determine if the property has been taken, meaning the balancing test that Deborah Trejo just explained to you. And the measure of takings damages is the value of the property for its intended purpose immediately prior to the imposition of the regulation and the value of the property after imposition of the regulation. So it's the property as a whole. It's not the separate bundle. It's not the separate stick of groundwater rights that's to be factored in. Here, this court said it's the entire property as a whole. So special notes on this, the EAA Enabling Act prohibits them from permitting any new wells after the effective date of the act. So the EAA did the only thing that it could do. If that well was not drilled during the historic use period, that well could not get a permit. And by the way, in the Day case, the Supreme Court said, yes, the EAA did exactly what the legislature told them they had to do. Only historic users are awarded permits under that permitting scheme. The permits all run in perpetuity, making it tantamount to a permanent water right. And the Braggs did have historic use on one well and investment-backed expectations of pecan orchards on both wells. The Braggs specifically argued, and the court specifically rejected the argument, that they were entitled to damages based on the market value of the groundwater they could not produce. Again, the damages were not based on the groundwater estate. The damages were based entirely on the value of the pecan orchards and whether or not they could continue to be productive pecan orchards. I meant to put this in, but I want to mention as well, on the home place orchard where they got the permit, that permit was based on 2 acre-foot for every acre of land that they owned and had irrigated during that historic use period. So they got the exact same permit every other irrigator got on the Edwards Aquifer system. If, in fact, that's determined to be the fair share, which I'm saying the legislature, I believe, was trying to say, for irrigators, the fair share is 2 acre-foot per acre. The Braggs were still entitled to damages because they had planned and invested in pecan trees that required more than the 2 acre-foot per acre. So the whole concept of fair share is very difficult to nail down. We don't know what a fair share is. We don't know if a fair share could be enough to produce domestic and livestock use. We don't know if the fair share is the same amount every other landowner gets on a per acre basis. We don't know if a fair share is the amount that they can produce without causing interference to their neighbor. We don't have any idea what a fair share is, and that's part of the frustration. And one of the jobs, I guess, that groundwater conservation districts are required to answer that question. In a follow-up case to that, the GG Ranch case versus EAA was filed in U.S. Federal District Court, and that court held that for anyone who failed to timely apply for a permit by the statutory deadline, which was December 30th, 1996, the statute of limitations had already run. So that's why there haven't been 10,000 more takings cases against the Edwards Aquifer Authority, because the 10-year statute of limitations has run, and because of that, they probably are free and clear at this point. All the people who did not get a permit and cannot ever get a permit and cannot ever drill a well without a permit are forever precluded from making their takings claim. Now, that's also why we're never going to see another Edwards Aquifer Authority. We're not ever going to see the market they've been able to set up, because the legislature is not going to create a situation where only X amount of water can be pumped and only the people who have pumped it in the past, or even only certain landowners, are able to produce that water. That's never going to happen again, because as soon as that gets passed by the legislature, the takings cases would start for people that don't qualify. Now, I don't know for sure what kind of damages they can claim, but I promise there'll be long, drawn-out, expensive litigation over it. I want to talk real quickly about Friendswood Development Company versus Smith Southwest Industries. The negligent question is again hard to nail down there. This is a direct quote from that case. Our consideration of this case convinces us that there is no valid reason to continue the special immunity, meaning the rule of capture, insofar as it relates to future subsidence proximately caused by negligence in the manner which wells are drilled or produced in the future. It appears that the ownership and rights of all landowners would be better protected against subsidence if each has the duty to produce water from his land in a manner that will not negligently damage or destroy the lands of others. So in the first sentence, it sounds like they're talking about you negligently drilled a well or you're negligently producing the water, which I'm not sure how you can negligently produce water. In the second sentence, they said negligence is proved up by the fact that you're damaging or destroying the lands of others. So I think we almost have a negligence per se standard here, where if you've caused subsidence, you've been negligent. So that's, again, until we get the next lawsuit, we're never really going to know for sure what negligently producing water or negligently damaging or destroying the lands of others may mean. So the only successful takings claim so far was the Bragg case. It involved investment-backed expectations for long-term use as pecan farm. The liability is based on the loss of the value of the pecan farm because the permit was limited to 2 acre-foot per acre on the home place orchard, or denied for the Dehennis orchard. And the statute they were operating under prohibited the district from either increasing their permit or issuing a permit for the Dehennis orchard at all. So what are some potential future claims? What are the issues? And here are some examples of questions that I think remain unanswered, or as one lawyer in Texas at least put it, as unsettled. Will granting a permit that causes drainage of adjoining property create a takings claim? And by the way, this is being litigated today in the Fazino case. In those situations, the plaintiff will likely have to produce loss in value of the property as a whole. It'll be difficult to prove loss in the value if the wells are still productive, or if there have never been any wells, if drainage is replaced by water recharging back onto the property. And a successful claim would allow landowners to sue districts, even though the rule of capture would prevent a successful suit against the entity actually pumping the groundwater. And by the way, in answer to the question a moment ago of, can I sue a neighbor for a taking? You clearly, well, you can sue anybody you want to sue. You're not going to have a successful suit against a neighbor, a private entity that is pumping that groundwater because of the rule of capture. But if you're suing a governmental entity, that's kind of an open question. If the government is taking your property, there may be a takings claim where, as opposed to a tort claim under the rule of capture. You may have a constitutional claim against a governmental entity where you don't have one in tort against a private entity. Another issue is denying a permit or prohibiting drilling a well going to be tantamount to a taking. Is the landowner able to develop the property? Can the landowner meet their investment-backed expectations? If I buy property, knowing that I've got to drill a well to be able to develop that property, and I have plans to drill a well on that property, and I'm told I can't drill that well, has my property been taken? Has the entire property been taken? Let alone, is that, does that tantamount to a per se, what Deborah referred to as confiscation of the property, where I've actually essentially moved in and taken all the property? Is an exempt use well enough to avoid takings liability under those circumstances? Will reducing authorized withdrawals under historic use permits result in takings liability? What is the impact there on investment-backed expectations? Is it possible to reduce historic use to a fair share amount, if we can finally define what a fair share means, without creating takings liability? Under both of those circumstances, because those historic users have very clear investment-backed expectations, they have investment in the well, they have investment in storage treatment plants, distribution systems, and they have investment in whatever business or enterprise they're operating on the property that needs that groundwater. I think these people have the greatest shot at a takings claim more than anybody else. Now, please remember, there's a balance. There has to be a balancing test there. So that raises kind of an interesting question. Who has the better claim? A landowner denied a permit or a historic user required to reduce their permit? I would love to be able to give you answers on these questions, but I can't. Until we have these lawsuits, we don't know what these answers are. So how will the courts address regulations of severed groundwater rights? You heard Deborah mention that groundwater rights can be severed from the main estate. Does that change somehow this analysis? Does that change how the court's going to look at what was taken? And will people try and take advantage of this by severing groundwater rights in a way that tries to prevent regulation of that those groundwater production? And because it's a balancing test, then we have to look at the other side of the equation as well, which is what is it that we're trying to achieve? Which public benefits might outweigh the private burden? If we're trying to prevent subsidence, is that good enough to say, no, we haven't caused a taking, even if we've limited people to a small percentage of the amount of groundwater they hope to, even they've invested to produce? Does that mean the preventing subsidence outweighs their investment and their burden of following that regulation? What about maintaining spring flow to surface water users? What about maintaining spring flow to provide for endangered species? What about ensuring every property owner over an aquifer has some access to groundwater? How do we do that? Do we let them know through our regulations that we're never going to tell a landowner, no, you may not have a well? But in order to do that, we're going to have to cut back on everybody else who's already pumping. Does that create liability to those who are already pumping? Or if we say no to the people that have never drilled a well yet, does that create liability? If both situations create liability, which one creates more liability to the district? That concludes my presentation. There's my contact information, which I think most of you already have. For those of you that don't know me, I represent groundwater conservation districts and subsidence districts around the state. That's the only side I take. I don't represent applicants ever. And I doubt that I'll ever be involved in a takings claim from on the side of the landowner. I may be involved in a takings claim on the side of a district. I certainly hope not. I'm going to do my very best to ensure that never happens. And but that concludes my presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you, Greg. Much appreciated. And do we have any questions for Greg? See if I can use this here. More of a statement. What is clear here is that water policy and law in Texas needs a rewrite. Rule of capture. Can't read this whole thing. I guess I should probably read this whole thing before I say it out loud, just in case, huh?
Yep. Is that my timer? Is my time up?
That was an approximation. Yes, I've been setting it for 25 minutes. We're doing good across the board.
Okay, I would like it to be noted, I finished before my time was up. That's the first time that's ever happened.
Get that in the record, Zach. Put it down.
We're seeing history.
Okay, that's more of a statement. I don't think it's quite appropriate for right here. That says company owner, whoever that is, submitted it. That being said, anybody else have a question for Greg?
If you'd like to send that to me, I'll be happy to do whatever I can to comment on it. But.
Okay. If I can capture it out of there.
Let me say one other thing real quickly. There's an old, supposedly Chinese saying that a man with one watch knows what time it is. A man with two is never sure. It's even worse when you're dealing with lawyers. You're going to hear from 5 different lawyers today. And if we don't have opinions from at least 5 different time zones, I'll be astounded.
Okie doke. I'm not, oh, maybe right. Well, that's Mr. Lennox from the previous. Okay, I'm seeing no questions for Greg. That moves us along to Miss Reese. Stacy, good. Is it still morning or afternoon? Good morning, Stacy.
Good morning. I thought we might take a break real quick, but that's okay. My presentation isn't that long, so maybe we can just power through. And then I might have to take a break after.
We can take a break now if you prefer.
That's okay.
Okay.
Let's keep going. Good. Let me show my. Okay, let me see if I can show my screen. I'm trying to just show my PowerPoint here, but I suppose y'all can't see that.
We're seeing the whole app open.
Okay.
So you have 3 slides.
Oh yeah, okay. So go back here.
If you click on the if you click on the little slideshow, it should fill your screen.
Okay, good. But you can only see my slideshow, correct?
Right now I can see your whole screen.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, is that better?
It was, and then it went down, and it shrunk.
Okay. So let me do it again. Better?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Stacy Reese, and I have a solo water and business litigation practice in Austin, Texas. I've been practicing law for about 14 years, and before I started practicing law, I was a special education teacher and principal for some Austin area schools. I previously worked at the law firm of McGinnis Lockridge for about 7 years, and then in 2013, I started my own law firm where I represent individuals, companies, governmental entities, Fortune 500 companies, small businesses in business and water litigation related matters. I'm also the general counsel, outside general counsel for Lone Star GCD. And outside of GMA 14, I represent landowners before groundwater districts. I thought that I would title my presentation, which is very short, Chapter 36, Property Rights, Ownership of Groundwater, to make it clear that what we're really talking about in Chapter 36 and what a GCD has authority over in regulation is groundwater. So it's clear that we're focused on the ownership of groundwater. And you all have seen this slide several times, or the content on this slide several times. This is, what does Chapter 36 say about ownership of groundwater? we know that an owner under the rule of capture can drill and produce water so long as the landowner doesn't cause waste, malicious drainage, or negligently causing subsidence. So that's the rule of capture codified in section 36.002. And then of course, subject to GCD regulation if in fact there is a groundwater district over within the jurisdiction of the landowner. Now we know that the district can adopt rules to, for well spacing, production limits, those types of things. And in essence then, when the groundwater district does that, the groundwater district is modifying the rule of capture. My colleagues have talked extensively about kind of the history of groundwater. So in the case law and the evolution of the case law. So I want to just focus on kind of some key points that I think are takeaways that the GCD reps need to be considering when they're considering property rights within the context of determining a DFC. First and most importantly, we know that there are different property regimes for surface water and groundwater, and that we know that surface water is owned by the state and trust for the public, and that it creates a vested right to use the water, but not actual ownership of the water itself, where you can contrast that with groundwater, where the landowners or whoever owns the groundwater rights, if the groundwater rights are severed from the surface estate, whoever owns the rights owns the actual corpus of the water. And that is a perpetual absolute right subject to the rule of capture in GCD regulation, as set forth in section 36.002. So it's important to remember the distinction between surface water and groundwater regimes. There are some tenets kind of groundwater or surface water is based on first in time, first in right. And there are some tenets or principles of that in chapter 36 with regard to, the ability to protect historic and existing use. But I remind you that because groundwaters own the groundwater themselves, as opposed to just having a right to use the water, that any protection of historic and existing use cannot be to the deprivation of new users or users who choose to exercise their right in the future. Now, we heard a lot from Deborah all about takings claims and specifically regulatory takings claims. And the key takeaway that I think when you're looking or talking about regulatory takings claims is that those can arise from the government's action or regulation that goes too far, that effectively acts like a taking of your property, not necessarily from the government's lack of regulation. So that's very important. The two cases that we have where there was a taking arising from groundwater regulation, we have the Bragg case where it was actually adjudicated fully to the merits, and we got a final determination of a taking and the measure of damages for that taking. And then we have the Day case where the Supreme Court affirmed that regulatory action can give rise to a taking, and then the case was remanded back and settled before the merits of the takings claim was fully adjudicated. But in both of those instances, the takings arose from the government's action or regulation that went too far. And it was the action or regulation as it pertains to the groundwater owner and their property right in groundwater. The permit was denied in its entirety in both of those instances, or only a portion of the requested authorization was granted. So I think that's really important when you're analyzing regulatory takings claims, and where the law currently stands today is what action or regulation is the government actually taking that gives rise to this taking of the groundwater ownership interest under Chapter 36. Now, I do agree that when you're doing the damage analysis, that there is a consideration of the impact of that regulation on all of your property rights. But that's sort of a separate analysis that we need to, make sure that we understand, how do you get to the takings in the first place? What creates that in a groundwater regulatory situation, separate and apart from how do you measure the damages if in fact you do determine that there is a takings. And the only two takings cases that exist are the ones where permits were denied in whole or in part. I heard Deborah talk about, and I know she's not on the call anymore, so I'm not going to throw things at her to answer, but that potentially subsidence, could give rise to a takings claim against a governmental entity. For example, the governmental entity's failure to enact regulation that would prevent subsidence on someone's property. And I think that's a very complicated analysis on where the current law stands today, because we only have those two cases where it was clear that the government's regulation was the denial of the permit in whole or in part. We might get there someday as takings law evolves, but currently that's not where we are today. So I think that that fact pattern creates complications in a takings analysis. Another point I wanted to make is that what you all are trying to do today is finding a balance between the highest practical level of production and conservation. And as we've heard Mr. Jones say, that property rights are the only factors that receive constitutional protection. That's not to say that the other factors are not important. It's just that Chapter 36 doesn't tell you how to weight them or balance them on that scale. And so when you're looking at what weight should you give each of these factors, I think it's an important consideration that the property rights in groundwater, which is all that GCDs have the authority to regulate under Chapter 36, that is the property right that receives constitutional protection. And of course, subsidence and socioeconomic impacts are important factors as well. And you all have a very difficult job trying to find a balance between all of that. I went back and tried to look at the prior DFC petitions from 2010, and then of course we know there was only one from 2016, the Lone Star DFC petition. But if you all remember, back in 2010, there were several, the regulatory scheme was different back then in terms of challenging a DFC, and that required sort of a complaint to the GMA that then was heard by the Water Development Board. And the Water Development Board put out reports analyzing the factors that were in play at the time, whatever the considerations were in Chapter 36 at that time. And when I went back and looked at those water development reports, I found some interesting things that I thought were relevant for this committee to consider. The Water Development Board's 2010 DFC petition reports acknowledge that the economic impacts of different pumping scenarios are very difficult to quantify. And I'm speaking here to socioeconomic and subsidence factors, because I think when you're talking about property rights, sometimes it's easier to say what is not a property right, right? So the Water Development Board acknowledged that economic impacts are difficult to quantify, and the Water Development Board in the report also noted that a number of factors affect water levels: the nature of the aquifer, precipitation amounts, the proximity of one well to another, and the nature of the use. The report goes on to note, the various reports, that reduced water levels and outflow to the surface water caused by natural events, such as a period of drought, or increases in population with concomitant increases in pumping may result in economic impacts. And importantly, the Water Development Board report also noted that economic impacts may also occur from limiting pumping of groundwater that would otherwise be put to a beneficial use. So when you get to the end of this whole 9-factor balancing analysis, I encourage you all to consider some of those other socioeconomic types of impacts when you're considering that factor, because I know we've heard a lot about, well, I'm going to have to spend money it's going to cost more money to lift the water. I'm going to have to, deepen my pump. All of those economic factors associated with additional production of groundwater. But there's also an economic factor associated with not authorizing additional groundwater to be produced that I think is important to consider. And the Water Development Board noted those types of economic impacts in its reports. We also know, we talked a lot about, subsidence, and we looked at the Friendswood case about a landowner's ability to have a claim for nuisance or trespass against a neighbor for subsidence. And then we've also talked about that we don't have a particular taking scenario fact pattern in groundwater regulation where the lack of a GCD's regulation, which then causes subsidence to a neighbor, gives rise to a takings claim. We just haven't seen that yet. I'm not saying that it won't get there at some point, but what we do know is that we're talking about regulation in and of itself that goes too far. And we've seen it in the two cases where it's the denial of a permit in whole or in part. In conclusion, I think that the development of the DFC must consider fair share. I know that the joint planning and DFC process is planning. We all agree that we're planning for the future conditions of what we want the aquifer to look like, but to not consider the implication of the management standard that is decided here, that desired future condition, not to consider the impact that it will have on the GCD, who is then required to go implement that management standard into its rules and adopt regulation that when it adopts it, that if it goes too far, can give rise to a takings claim. So that's how I think that it's very important that you need to factor in fair share into this DFC development, because it has an implication, even if this is the planning part of the process, it certainly has a real implication back at the local level for the GCD. Again, balance is a key here. It is certainly challenging to manage the common reservoir without common rules, right? We've got people within our GMA who are using the aquifer who are not, who don't have a GCD within their jurisdiction. We have special districts also within our GMA, and we all have different, they have different regulatory schemes and situations than a GCD does. The subsidence districts are, have a statutory mandate to end subsidence, which is different than what a GCD statutory mandate is under Chapter 36. It is to develop rules to help control subsidence, and it's to consider the impacts on subsidence when you are developing a DFC. And when, again, talking about the subsidence factor within the context of property rights and how you might weight that factor in this process, I think that there has to be some reasonable level of subsidence considered, because we know that the subsidence districts were put in place to stop subsidence, right? Because we know it was occurring, and they're doing a good job of that. They're not doing it overnight. They have a plan that's been in place for decades of how they're going to try to regulate to eventually end subsidence, but subsidence is still occurring. And I don't mean that as a criticism, but because we don't have any guidance on what subsidence, the impact on subsidence factor is supposed to mean for a GCD, I think it's helpful to consider and look at what the subsidence districts are doing and what's happening there to evaluate how a GCD should consider impacts on subsidence. When you have separate, special districts tasked specifically with ending subsidence and how they are managing to that, and still considering demands and needs and balancing all of that, including costs, with how they're going to regulate to eventually try to curtail subsidence or stop it. And kind of in conclusion, this is a balancing test. Lone Star certainly understands that not all current and future demands can be met exclusively with groundwater, but we do know that all owners must be provided an opportunity for a fair share. I think that needs to be considered during the development of this DFC. The rule of capture certainly provided a remedy to a neighbor by the right to drill an offsetting well. And I think when you layer GCD regulation on top of that, we know that one purpose is to consider fair share. And so we have to make sure that we are giving those landowners who want to exercise their right in the future the ability to do that. That is their self-help remedy to be able to offset what their neighbor might be doing. And I know that that's something that's to be litigated in the Fazzino case, but I do think when you're talking about fair share that there is this component or piece of self-help remedies for the landowners. You have to ensure that you are providing that opportunity for them to do that. And I think that kind of concludes my presentation. If anybody has any specific questions for me, try to get back to my screen. Can y'all see me again? Or I can see you guys, I guess.
Thank you, Stacy. Let me check over here, see if we got any questions in the little box here.
I guess the only other thing I will say, that kind of looking back on my notes, I do have one more comment. Just kind of about how do we, sustainability. I've heard some questions about, or comments about sustainability throughout this meeting today and kind of prior meetings as well. And I read chapter 36 as saying, listen, you have to balance all of these factors between, and your DFC your management standard needs to demonstrate the balance between the highest level of practicable production and conservation, meaning that we are not solely over into this entire sustainability category anymore. We're not over here where you can pump and deplete all the storage in the aquifer on the other end of the spectrum. We're somewhere in between all of that, right? And I think that's supported by the fact that the MAG is no longer a managed available groundwater number that operates as a pumping cap. It is a modeled available groundwater number, and it is something that is considered in this process, and it's something that the districts are required to consider before issuing a permit. And Lone Star certainly, has concerns about going back to a sustainability type of management standard, given its the DFC was found to be unreasonable, and that was based upon a sustainability goal and a pumping cap, and then the more recent issues with its reduction rule that was found to be invalid. So again, on that balancing of the spectrum, it's certainly expecting you all to look at those 9 factors and find some happy medium between the two ends of sustainability, absolute conservation, and deplete the storage of the aquifer. And I don't envy your job. It is very difficult, and I commend you for your thoughtful work, most certainly.
Thank you, Stacy. It is definitely a challenging project we have here with DFCs. Does not look like we have any online questions. Any of the members have questions? Comments otherwise? If not, I'm going to pass this along to Mr. Jason Hill. How are you this afternoon, sir?
Good, John. How are you doing?
Not bad at all. Floor is yours.
All right. Well, I came to this with the perspective of, and come to this with the perspective of not really to get into the nuances of constitutional law, what constitutes a taking, what doesn't constitute a taking. I think those issues have been covered very well and have created a plenty of opportunity for discussion on the nuances of the decisions on each individual permitting matter that may come before each of you as groundwater district managers and representatives. The perspective I wanted to come at with you from is the broader picture. And I think sometimes, traditionally, the issue of the neighboring landowner gets kept out of the discussion when you talk about the bigger picture issues of groundwater regulation. Actually, that issue came up a few times in the public comment portion, and I was encouraged and pleased to hear that folks recognize that these decisions, while in the takings context may come on a case-by-case basis, there is a bigger picture here. Every private property owner, or every property owner, has a neighbor that's a property owner, has a neighbor that's a property owner. And that's the case throughout the state of Texas. And decisions on what each individual property owner may do or may not be allowed to do under the law can have a substantial impact on not just their independent piece of property, the value of their independent piece of property, but the value of the property of their neighbors. And so I think sometimes what gets lost in the discussion is that the issue of regulation versus the circumstances of no regulation can impact property values either way, depending on which side of the fence line you might be standing on. I've thought about this as a real rough analogy, but sometimes I've likened this circumstance to noise ordinances. you know, as a property owner in town, although I'm not really inclined to play music in the background very loud, if I was inclined to do so, I sure want to be given the opportunity to play the music as loud as I want to. But the second my neighbor does it, I'm picking up the phone and I'm making a complaint. City ordinances typically recognize that and have ordinances that are designed to govern what can or can't be done in those instances through noise ordinances, and typically they come with, you know, decibel level restrictions on what you know, the level of noise that can, you know, that can cross over your property line. You know, as a property owner, the more restrictive I am and more restricted I am on what I can do in my backyard, the more that impacts my ability to exercise my rights as a private property owner. And that can have an impact on ultimately perhaps the value of my property. If I'm looking at purchasing a piece of property and I drive up in the driveway and I find out that the neighbor likes to play loud music at every, you know, 9 o'clock every Sunday morning, that's probably going to influence the value that I place on that particular home that I'm looking at. It's a real rough analogy, but I think it illustrates the point that properties have values that aren't always independently set, but they're also based on the uses of property that, you know, that are allowed across the fence line and across the fence line and across the fence line. And, you know, to take it a step further, we've talked about, you know, lawsuits from against, you know, one neighbor against the other. In those instances, I might be able to sue my neighbor for a nuisance claim because they are getting in the middle of my ability to peacefully enjoy the use of my property. The courts give me that ability, at least on paper. There's a potential I might have a nuisance claim against them. You know, when you turn that over into groundwater, the analog there in the groundwater context would be the rule of capture. And of course, the rule of capture tells me as a landowner, I can't sue my neighbor for damages. So I don't have a venue through court to protect, in this instance, the value and the sanctity of my property. And that's the law. Like it or hate it, that's been the law in Texas, as Marty said, since you know, since 1904. But on the other hand, the legislature, I think, in recognizing this, and as the courts, I think, particularly the Supreme Court, has recognized over the course of the year, that the outcome there, the outcome for Mr. East in the 1904 case, or even more recently, I still have to call 1999 recent, even more recently in the, you know, the case folks recognize as the Ozarka decision, the Ozarka Bottling Company's neighbor, Mr. Cipriano, those guys came out on the short end of the stick under a rule of capture protection. They had water that was drained out completely from beneath their property. It had a, you know, incredible, obvious impact on the value of their property, completely upset their way of life. I don't know the Ciprianos. I just know how the case was articulated by the Supreme Court. But the point is that for every, you know, extended open opportunity to use your property without limits, that has a direct consequence on the private property rights of the person across the fence. And, you know, of course, there is a constitutional requirement, and obviously the US Constitution and the state constitution, that says is that the more you squelch down and impact private property to the point where you take that property, or in the case of the Constitution, where the point in exercising your powers of eminent domain, or through inverse condemnation type liability, the more you restrict that property, there's a point in time where you have actually taken that property, and if that's the case, then the affected landowner is entitled to just compensation. That's constitutionally clear, no question about it. And, you know, to the point, Marty, that you made earlier about the, you know, in Chapter 36, the issue of property rights being the only constitutionally, I'm going to paraphrase you here a little bit, but the only constitutionally protected element on the list of considerations a groundwater district must make in making permitting decisions. I'll take a little bit of issue with that because there is also a secondary constitutional provision in the Texas Constitution, I think was mentioned earlier, maybe in the public comments, I can't recall. It was ratified in 1917 by the people of the state. It created a public right and duty for us as Texans to have our natural resources conserved and protected, and it affirmatively charged the legislature with the obligation to carry out that duty. So it's the legislature's constitutional requirement to enact laws or take other action to preserve and conserve the natural resources of the state. And of course, that constitutional provisions have been exercised in many different ways. But you know, it is the backbone. It's the constitutional door opening, so to speak, of the creation of Chapter 36 and groundwater conservation districts. And as a byproduct then, or as a direct result, Chapter 36 is the product of a constitutional mandate from the legislature to conserve and preserve the groundwater resources of the state of Texas. It's obviously that's not to say that private property rights aren't important. In fact, I think Chapter 36 is an articulation of the importance of private property right protection as the legislature has seen it, but on a broad scale that trickles down to individual requirements that districts have to look at and rely on in making their decisions, not just in the permitting process, but in the rulemaking process, in your management plan adoption process and development process, all the way up through the establishment of DFCs. All that is allowed under the Constitution, not through police powers like you might see municipalities exercise, but through a very specific delegation of authority, constitutional authority that the legislature has to create this regulatory scheme. I think there is, as a consequence, a real tension constitutionally between the obligation to justly compensate a disaffected landowner for a taking and the obligation of the legislature to create laws to preserve and conserve the natural resources of the state of Texas. And I think that Chapter 36 is the byproduct or the balancing point, so to speak, of the legislature's attempt to strike the balance or to relieve the pressure from that tension. Obviously, when you're looking at 36108, there are multiple factors there under 36108D. Today, we're talking about the private property rights factor. And it sounds like that you guys have covered other factors in your previous meetings. And I think it's good that you go through them one-on-one. I think that's a healthy exercise to break them down and have good discussions about them. But you can't take them all independently in a vacuum when you're making decisions as a groundwater conservation district. And I say this from the perspective of as a private property owner that I may represent, or as a private property owner myself. I don't want my neighbor to be able to play music as loud as he or she possibly can when I want to peacefully enjoy my backyard. At the same time, I don't want to be told I can't. But there has to be some balance struck between the two. And I think the legislature recognizes that. And I think the legislature's attempt to protect private property rights, in my opinion, is articulated throughout Chapter 36. Not just Chapter 36108D7, but I think the construct of Chapter 36 is the legislature's recognition that private property rights must be protected, and I think the entire chapter is instructions to groundwater districts on how to protect those rights. If it were a simple analysis of a one-on-one review of impacts of the exercise of a district's power on my ability as a landowner to use my property for how I want to. If it was just a simple one-on-one analysis, Chapter 36 might be a couple of pages long. It's not. Everybody on the video screen knows that. It obviously, groundwater regulation obviously is a very complex issue. And it's a recognition, I think, from the legislature as it's been modified throughout the years, that there is no really easy, truly easy answer to how to regulate responsibly this resource while carrying out the legislative constitutional mandate to preserve property resources in the state, to protect property owners from encroachment by government power, and to, at the same time, support business operations, encourage economic development, and ultimately allow you as a property owner to enjoy the fruits of your labor and enjoy the investment that you've made in your particular piece of property. And so for that reason, again, I'm not here to give legal advice. I'm certainly not here to be a constitutional scholar, because if I didn't make that disclaimer clear at the beginning, I'll make it now. But I know the question that a lot of the representatives of the individual districts here and the GMA are faced with is, what do we do? How do we carry out our legislative mandate? How do we make sure we don't step over the line and into the muck of a potential takings liability? And from muck, I mean, you've gone beyond what a court might consider reasonable regulation, or whatever the threshold might be, into the area where you have encroached upon private property, and therefore you have an obligation to make that property owner whole. Fair share is a term that obviously has become a term of art. It has been for a while. It's not new. And in the discussions of groundwater policy in the state, it didn't just show up in the Day decision. It's been a term that the legislature, I know, has considered for a while. There is no definition of fair share. It's an open question. I think there are completely reasonable folks and making reasoned opinions about what that term may be. But the legislature hasn't given you a definition, and nor have the courts. Certainly not a black and white definition that you can crack open in a book and point to with your finger and say, we have met that standard, or we haven't. Congratulations, as groundwater conservation districts. These are decisions that you're going to have to make independently in many cases, based on all the information that you have in front of you. And it's not just in the context of individual permitting decisions. It's in the context of your exercise and development of your broader regulatory scheme and your approach to regulating groundwater within your jurisdictions. And so I think from a policy standpoint, which is really where I approach this from, much more than a constitutional one, I think it's important. Clients that I represent think it's very important, not only to protect the sanctity of individual private property rights on a permitting basis, but to recognize from a broader picture that as a private property owner, I have a neighbor. That neighbor is a private property owner, and so on and so forth. And for whatever restriction you may place on me, or whatever broad authorization you may give to my neighbor, it's not only going to affect those individual pieces of property. There's going to be neighbors on the other side of the fence, metaphorically or even literally, who also could suffer deprivation of property values. And because it's not necessarily a taking in that respect, the avenue that somebody might have in a more traditional setting is to go to the courthouse and to sue for damages for drainage and whatnot, isn't available, because the rule of capture makes it clear that the draining landowner, so to speak, is essentially immune from damages to the neighbor. And so that harsh result, I think the legislature has tried to cure with Chapter 36. We saw in that Cipriano decision in 1999 that the Supreme Court wasn't too keen on that being the outcome either, and flirted, gave lots of discussion at least to abandoning the rule of capture and focusing instead on a correlative rights approach or reasonable use approach. And instead, the court looked to the legislature, looked to the Conservation Amendment of the Texas Constitution, and it recognized that it's not the court's role to write water policy in the state or to regulate the resource. It's the legislature. And at that time, Senate Bill 1 was coming up and was or actually had just been passed. Groundwater districts had really started a new day in the life of groundwater regulation in Texas at that time. The court stepped back and said, let's see how these guys, meaning the legislature and these groundwater districts, handle this responsibility. To circle back around and make clear the point, I think there are lots of considerations to be made in the jobs that y'all do. I don't think, Marty, I'll take issue with one of the comments that you made. I don't think that it's fair to hang the idea of individual liability for your directors and your general managers on these decisions that you make. In my opinion, the best way to avoid any of those concerns, to the extent that there's even an avenue for liability there, is to follow the law. And the law in your court is Chapter 36. And if you have overstepped your bounds in the decisions that you make individually or even regulatory on a broader scale, the courts are going to tell you that you've overstepped your bounds. The courts are going to tell you that you have encroached upon property in a way that the Constitution requires you to make that property owner whole. But I don't think it's fair to expect each one of you to be constitutional scholars necessarily and understand where that bright line might be. I think the legislature has told you what your job is in Chapter 36. And I think your obligation as groundwater district managers and board members are to follow what the legislature has told you to do. That's it.
Thank you, sir. Much appreciated, Jason. Let me check the comment list over here. I do not see any new questions being asked. And do any of our members or interlocal participants have any questions?
Hey, John, this is Mike Turco. I just wanted to thank all of the panel participants today for taking time out of your day to provide all the perspectives related to this issue. It's a complicated issue for the lawyers. So you can only imagine what it's like for us. So we certainly appreciate your time, and thank you for all the information for today.
Agreed. I cannot reiterate exactly what you said enough. That's perfect statement to end this discussion on.
I have a comment. Could I make one?
Sure.
I just wanted to say, Jason, I totally agree with what you were saying about fair share and that it's not defined in Chapter 36 and that it's hard to understand what that means. I completely agree and echo that sentiment. And I like also how you're saying that you have to look at it on a broader context throughout whether your entire rules and regulations are providing an opportunity for a fair share. And I think when you put that within the context of joint planning, it's even broader than just your own district. It's is it effectively occurring throughout, the GMA? So I just wanted to let you know that I echo those points and agree with it.
Cool.
John, I have one thing to say. I haven't been to a lot of these meetings that are virtual, but I will tell you that early on, when we were still meeting all together, we had some very heated discussions about what the desired future conditions should be, and there was some back and forth about what was done right, what was done wrong, and in that came this dialogue where we're discussing all of these property rights, where we're discussing all of these things that really are going to make the desired future conditions even better. So I applaud all of you guys the panel and also the folks that are the participants of the GMA who understand that it is quite difficult to navigate through what is considered constitutional law, state law, and federal law when it comes to water. And we do know that we all require the need for water. And we understand that not everyone's shared responsibility is the same. Not everyone defines what their equal share is as equal. I could say that my equal share is 10,000 gallons every hour, whereas my neighbor may say it's only 1,000 gallons every hour. So defining that is like a moving target. And I think that what we need and what we needed then and what we're getting now is more dialogue on how we move forward. I really applaud that, and I appreciate all of the information that's being provided just through this meeting, because as you are all aware, I have not been able to make these meetings as frequent as I would like. So thanks a lot. And I know you guys have, I've been reading the information that you guys present me through the Dropbox, but I haven't been able to attend in person. So I just want to thank everybody. It is a difficult situation. We all are dealing with it differently in our communities. What's happening in Montgomery County is not happening in my community, but I understand that it very well could be. So we all have skin in the game and we all have a reason to be here. So it's just really appreciative of everyone that does everything and does all the work.
Thank you, Kirk. And before anybody else gets open their mouth, I'm moving along, man. We got our record beaten, and I'm good. Let's move on to agenda item 10, discussion and possible action. Did I miss 9? Presentation discussions by districts, interlocal agreement participants of recent activities of interest or impacting the GMA planning group. Anybody have anything of note that can't wait till next meeting?
The only thing I would note right quick is those of y'all remember several meetings ago, there's a study with the University of Oklahoma that should be starting. I know several of y'all have been in contact with them, but it's centered around the reactions in response to flooding. So anybody that would like to participate or could participate in that, please let me know and I'll forward you on the information.
And John, just wanted to reiterate something that Larry French referred to early on. There will be a stakeholder meeting for the joint regulatory planning review that's being carried out by the Harris, Galveston, and Fort Bend subsidence districts. That'll be on December 10th at 10 o'clock. If you have more information on that process or on the project itself, you can go to our website and sign up for notifications, and you get all the newsletters and all that. So if anybody has any questions about that, wants more information, they can certainly reach out to me. I just want to make everybody aware of that.
Highly recommend attending those if you have time. They are very, very interesting. A lot of good information comes out of those. So I've already registered for it. Anybody else? Moving along, number 10, discussion and possible action regarding the DFC board for GMA 14 to accomplish statutory mandates for round 3 joint planning. Wade, what do we need to do? I guess this is kind of intermingles with number 12, but is there anything we need to take care of before we start on those last 2 items?
Other than you're going to get an email from me in the next week with some draft sections on the explanatory report that I would encourage you guys to review. And then the next meeting will be covering the feasibility of achieving the DFCs and other factors, which this group has defined that we're going to take a look at faulting. So that's what's happening in January. Or at least that's the schedule that I've proposed.
Anybody like to add anything to that item? Moving along, number 11, GMA 14 interlocal agreement financial report. Mike?
Very quickly, I emailed you all a copy of the financial report or summary through the end of October. Things are progressing as we expected. There's no issues that we've identified, and things are moving along.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Any questions for Mike? Okay, back to the, we'll adjourn the interlocal agreement participants portion of the meeting and get back to the portion of the GMA member districts reconvening. And that brings us to item 12, discussion possible action regarding the next meeting date, location, and agenda items. For starters, we'll have at least 2 additional presentations probably. I could probably put them under one topic. After our last meeting, I had City of Conroe reached out asking to present. Actually, we're hoping to get in on this meeting, but I backed them off because I saw that this one might go a little long. Sam was also able to gather some information on water costs throughout the area, or at least locally there in Montgomery County, not sure which, but she'll give us that information. And then we'll have the last 2 items, which will be the other category specifically meant to get the take into consideration the faulting issue, and there was one other, right, Ray? There were 2 issues for next meeting.
It was the feasibility of achieving DFCs, and that's going to be a pretty straightforward conversation.
Cool. So, anybody else have anything that they would like to get on that next agenda? Moving along, then let's see if we can find us a date and a time to work with. Don't suspect we'll need a full 3 or 4 hours. Please, God, please. The 3rd week of January work for folks? Do we need it sooner? Do we need it later? Is that enough time? How about the 23rd? It's a Wednesday. 10 o'clock?
What day and time are you looking at?
January 23. Wait a minute, make sure I'm not that. Yeah, hang on. We're still in December. Inauguration day on anybody have a problem interrupting their inauguration day and having a meeting on the 20th of January? $10, January 20 work for everybody? This is frightening.
Gary's good. Gary's good.
Works for me.
For me. Mr. Turco, availability with, I'm guessing with the uptick of cases and whatnot on COVID, we're probably not going to want to get together and throw 75 people in a room again quite yet. So it's okay with you.
Yep, shouldn't be a problem.
Cool, much appreciated. Then I think we can call it. I think that's the first time we picked a date and time, and it flew. January 20th, 10 a.m. Next item, meeting adjourned. Enjoy the holidays, everybody. Thanksgiving, Christmas. Have a great time.
Thank
See
you all.
y'all later. Thanks, everybody in the general
Thank
public.
you, guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Presenters, thank you.
Thanks,
Ciao,
everybody.
Appreciate it.
Boom.